In the year 1521, somewhere on a narrow causeway stretching across a glittering lake in the middle of Mexico, an empire that had taken generations to build came apart in ways that still seem almost impossible to believe. Not because of an overwhelming army, not because of superior numbers, but because of 168 Spanish soldiers, a web of unlikely alliances, and a cascade of decisions that nobody fully controlled and nobody could take back. 168 men. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Because the Aztec Empire at its height commanded tribute from millions of people across hundreds of thousands of square miles. It had warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for battle. It had a capital city so large and so magnificent that the Europeans who first saw it thought they were dreaming, or hallucinating, or dead. One soldier famously wrote that it looked like the enchanted things described in the Book of Amadis. And yet here we are, talking about 168 men. Now the honest version of this story is little more complicated than a single afternoon. The dramatic compression of what happened into one decisive moment is real, and we'll get there, but the truth is that the fall of the Aztec Empire was built from months of manoeuvring, misunderstanding, violence, plague, and a kind of political gravity that pulled everyone toward a collision they could see coming and couldn't stop. What happened in that final afternoon was really the last drop of water that broke a dam that had been cracking for 2 years. But the afternoon itself, that part is real. There was a moment, a specific, identifiable moment above a lake city threaded with causeways and canals when something cascaded, when panic moved through a population like a wave, when a civilization that had seemed permanent suddenly didn't. If you're listening to this right now trying to drift off, that's exactly what this is for. A slow, vivid walk through one of the strangest and most consequential turning points in human history. No sharp edges, no sudden noise, just a story that unfolds at the pace of something that happened 500 years ago on the other side of the world. And if you're finding this for the first time, maybe tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is. I always look. It's midnight in Manila. It's 4 a.m. in Melbourne. It's someone in Sao Paulo who should really be asleep. Tell me where you're listening from. The setting for this story is a city built on water. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, sat in the middle of a lake called Texcoco, connected to the surrounding land by long elevated causeways that could be cut off, flooded, or defended. It was an engineering achievement that had no parallel in the Americas and very few in the world. The people who built it had started from almost nothing, a wandering group who had been told by everyone around them that they were unwelcome, and who had looked out at a swampy, inhospitable island and decided to build their future there anyway. That origin story matters because it tells you something about the kind of society that eventually sat at the centre of the empire. Tough, adaptive, politically ruthless, and built on a religious framework that demanded human sacrifice at a scale that shocked even the other civilizations around them. The Aztec world was not a gentle place, but it was a coherent one, with its own logic and its own beauty, and its own sense of order. Into that world in 1519 came a small group of strangers from the east, men with metal armour and horses and guns, none of which had ever been seen in this part of the world. Led by a man named Hernán Cortés, a low-ranking colonial official who had technically launched this expedition against the explicit orders of his superiors, which tells you something about the kind of person he was. Ambitious to a degree that bordered on reckless, brilliant in ways that were inseparable from his cruelty. But Cortés alone, even Cortés with 168 soldiers, doesn't explain what happened. The explanation is more tangled than that, and honestly more interesting. Because this story also belongs to a woman named Malintzin, whose role has been argued about ever since, and to the people of Tlaxcala, who made a choice that changed everything, and to Moctezuma, who may or may not have believed he understood what was happening, right up until it was too late. All of that is ahead. For now, just settle in. To understand how something that large could fall, you have to first understand how large it actually was. Tenochtitlan at its height was home to somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, depending on which estimates you trust. That made it one of the biggest cities on Earth in 1519, bigger than London, bigger than Rome had been for centuries, bigger than almost anywhere a European soldier of that era would have come from. The men who walked into it for the first time had no frame of reference for what they were seeing, because nothing in their experience had prepared them for a city that size built on a lake. The lake was the key to everything. The island sat in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways running north, south, and west. Wide enough for horses to walk, long enough that you could stand at the edge of the city and watch someone disappear into the distance before they reached solid ground. The causeways had removable sections, gaps that could be opened to let canoe traffic through, or to stop an advancing army in its tracks. The whole design was, whether deliberately or not, one of the most defensible urban positions imaginable. You couldn't surround it. You couldn't rush it. To attack Tenochtitlan, you had to come down a narrow road with water on both sides and a city full of warriors waiting at the end. Inside the city, canals ran between the buildings the way streets would have elsewhere. Tens of thousands of canoes moved through them every day, carrying food, goods, people, and tribute from every corner of the empire. The great market at Tlatelolco, the sister city just to the north, reportedly handled 60,000 transactions a day. The Spanish who saw it compared it favourably to the markets of Seville and Constantinople. They weren't being sentimental, they were genuinely astonished. At the centre of all of it stood the Templo Mayor, the great dual pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain. The temple wasn't just a religious monument, it was a political statement visible from every part of the city, a permanent reminder of what made Aztec power legitimate. Because legitimacy here wasn't primarily about laws or bloodlines, though those mattered. It was about cosmic obligation. The sun needed to be fed. The gods required human hearts and human blood to keep the universe in motion. War wasn't just conquest. It was maintenance of the world order. This is where the Triple Alliance comes in. The Aztec Empire wasn't actually run by a single king sitting on a single throne. It was a partnership between 3 city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, with Tenochtitlan gradually pulling more weight than the other 2 over time. Together they had spent the better part of a century absorbing surrounding territories, not always through direct military occupation, but through a system of tribute. You paid in cotton, cacao, feathers, jade, and people. In exchange, you were generally left to run your own internal affairs, as long as the tribute kept arriving and you acknowledged where the centre of the universe was. The system worked, right up until it didn't, and there were already signs by 1519 that the edges were fraying. Some provinces had been incorporated through brutal campaigns that left deep resentments. Others had been brought in through negotiation and felt the arrangement was one-sided. The Aztec approach to empire was less about direct control and more about political gravity, keeping enough pressure on enough people that resistance seemed more costly than compliance. But that kind of power requires constant maintenance, constant demonstration that the centre holds, which is why capturing enemies mattered more than killing them. A dead enemy proves a battle was won. A captive enemy dragged to the top of the Templo Mayor and sacrificed in front of 60,000 people proves the gods are still watching and still fed. The theatre of power was inseparable from the power itself. What no one had fully accounted for was what happens when the theatre breaks down, when something arrives from outside the known world that doesn't know the script, doesn't fear the gods, and has no intention of playing its assigned role in the cosmic order. That was coming, but it would take time to arrive. In February of 1519, 11 ships left the Cuban coast carrying somewhere between 500 and 600 soldiers, a handful of priests, a few hundred Cuban indigenous auxiliaries, 16 horses, and enough weapons and supplies to either start a colony or die trying. The man leading them, Hernán Cortés, was 33 years old and operating in a legal grey zone that should have gotten him killed before he ever reached the mainland. His expedition had been authorized by the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, and then unauthorized when Velázquez changed his mind and decided Cortés was becoming too independent. Cortés sailed anyway. That decision alone tells you something about the kind of man he was, and something about the kind of enterprise this was. Not a disciplined military operation sanctioned by a crown. a gamble taken by a man who understood that the rewards of success were large enough to make the risks worth taking, and that coming back empty-handed was its own kind of failure. The men with him weren't soldiers in any professional modern sense. Some had fought in the Caribbean. Some had experience from earlier Spanish expeditions that had probed the Yucatan coast and come back with stories of large, organized civilizations inland. A few had been captured by Maya groups and spent years learning local languages before escaping or being ransomed. They were adventurers, landless younger sons, men looking for the kind of fortune that wasn't available to them in Spain, or even in the Caribbean colonies that were already starting to feel crowded and disappointing. What they shared was a willingness to be somewhere dangerous, in exchange for a chance at something extraordinary. When they reached the Mexican Gulf Coast and began their first tentative contacts with coastal peoples, neither side had much idea what they were actually looking at. The Spanish saw organized settlements, elaborate clothing, evidence of sophisticated political structures, and offerings of food that suggested the people meeting them were trying to figure out the same thing they were. Whether these strangers were a threat, an opportunity, or something the existing categories of the world didn't quite cover. The coastal groups, many of them subjects of the Triple Alliance paying tribute they resented, saw large wooden vessels, men in metal and cloth, and animals none of them had encountered before. The horses matter here, but not quite in the way the simplified version of this story usually tells it. Yes, horses were unfamiliar. Yes, some coastal peoples initially interpreted a man on horseback as a single creature. But that interpretation didn't last long. People are observant. People figure things out. What the horses provided wasn't permanent supernatural terror. It was tactical advantage, mobility, shock value in a first encounter that could scatter a formation before it became a battle. A cavalry charge in an open field against warriors who had never seen it could break a line that might otherwise hold. That advantage was real, and it mattered. But it was a military tool, not a magic trick, and treating it as magic tends to flatter the Spanish at the expense of understanding what actually happened. Same with steel and firearms. Spanish swords and armour were genuinely superior for close combat against obsidian weapons and quilted cotton protection. Steel holds an edge differently. It doesn't shatter. It doesn't require the same brittle geometry that makes obsidian blades devastating, but fragile. The firearms of 1519 were loud, unpredictable, and slow to reload. In a prolonged engagement, they were more useful for noise and disruption than sustained firepower. But noise and disruption matter enormously in the first moments of contact, when confusion can be turned into advantage by someone moving fast enough. Cortés understood this. He used his technological assets as force multipliers, not as guarantees. The question of how 168 men, which is actually the number that eventually mattered in one crucial moment, could avoid being wiped out immediately is partly answered by these tools. But only partly. The rest of the answer lived in the politics of the coast they had landed on. The first major contact came near present-day Tabasco, where a confederation of Maya communities sent a force to push the Spanish back. The battle at Cintla went badly for the Maya, partly because of the horses and firearms, partly because Spanish crossbows could reach further than the weapons arrayed against them. Afterward, the defeated lords presented Cortés with tribute, including 20 enslaved women. One of them would become the most important person in the entire conquest, though her importance is still routinely underestimated. We'll get to her shortly. But the political landscape being revealed in these early encounters was just as significant as any battle. The people Cortés was meeting along the coast were not uniformly loyal subjects of Tenochtitlan. Some were reluctant tribute payers looking for leverage. Some were independent groups who had managed to stay outside the Triple Alliance's reach, but felt its pressure every year. Some had been recently conquered in campaigns that left generational wounds. The Aztec Empire's genius for political gravity, the system that kept provinces in line through obligation and fear rather than direct occupation, also meant that the centre was not everywhere loved. It was in many places merely tolerated because the alternative seemed worse. Cortés was not slow to notice this. The conversations he was having through halting translation, through gestures and trade goods, and the careful reading of how people talked about the power in the interior, were teaching him something crucial. He had not arrived in a unified empire rallied behind a single beloved ruler. He had arrived at the edges of a structure held together partly by force, partly by religious authority, and partly by the absence of any coalition strong enough to challenge it. The absence of that coalition was what had kept the system running. The question forming in Cortés's mind, whether fully articulated or not, was whether something arriving from completely outside the system could do what no internal rival had managed. 168 people cannot conquer an empire. That was true then, and it remains true now. But 168 people with the right alliances, arriving at the right political moment, moving faster than anyone could coordinate a response against them, might be able to reach the centre before the system understood what was happening. That was the bet. It would take months to find out if it was a suicidal bet or a brilliant one. And almost every step of the way, the answer was genuinely unclear. Her name in the documents is slippery. In some, she's Marina. In others, Doña Marina, the honorific marking her as a baptized Christian woman under Spanish protection. In Nahuatl sources, she appears as Malintzin, or Malinali, the reverent Zin ending attached to her name, and, over time, blurred with the title given to Cortés himself. In later Mexican memory, she becomes La Malinche, a figure so charged that her name can mean traitor, victim, mother, or origin story depending on who's speaking. We don't know what her parents called her. We know pieces. She was born somewhere on the Gulf Coast, probably in a Nahua-speaking community that paid tribute toward the interior. As a child, she seems to have been caught up in the currents of regional politics, perhaps sold, perhaps given away, perhaps traded as part of an inheritance dispute we only hear about in one later Spanish account. However it happened, she passed into Maya-speaking territory as a slave. By the time Cortés arrived, she was in Tabasco, one of 20 women given as tribute after the defeat at Cintla. She would have been a teenager. She spoke at least 2 languages fluently, the Nahuatl of her birth and the Chontal Maya of the region that now held her. That combination made her valuable long before anyone realized how valuable. Cortés almost missed it. When the women were distributed among the expedition as servants and concubines, Malintzin was included in the group handed over to common soldiers. She was, in Spanish eyes, one more human spoil of war. What changed was the arrival of another man already attached to the expedition, Geronimo de Aguilar. Aguilar had been shipwrecked years earlier on the Yucatan coast and survived as a captive and then as a kind of adopted outsider among Maya speakers. By 1519 he spoke Spanish and Maya but no Nahuatl. Cortés obviously spoke Spanish but no Maya. Most of the people whose politics now mattered spoke Nahuatl and perhaps some regional languages, but not Maya and certainly not Spanish. What existed in that moment was a broken chain. Each group could gesture, trade, attempt to guess at intentions, but anything more complicated than "we want water" or "we have chickens" was getting lost. Then someone noticed that one of the enslaved women seemed to be understanding Aguilar's Maya and responding to the coastal emissaries in a different tongue. We don't know exactly how her ability was recognized. We have later stories of her correcting an interpreter, of her revealing her knowledge accidentally and then being brought to Cortés. However it happened, the result was simple and profound. Cortés suddenly had what almost nobody on either side had in that moment: the possibility of sustained conversation. The chain ran like this. A local lord or messenger spoke in Nahuatl to Malintzin. She rendered their words into Chontal Maya for Aguilar. Aguilar translated that into Spanish for Cortés, then back again through Maya into Nahuatl. 3 steps, 3 sets of ears and mouths. Every sentence had to survive at least 2 transformations and pass through 3 different minds, each with their own interests, fears, and assumptions. And yet through this fragile chain came the first real negotiations, the first threats, the first subtle tests of what each side wanted. Language wasn't just a tool for exchanging information. In this world, surrounded by city-states and provinces knit together by tribute, marriage, and war, language carried status. the formality or informality of address, the metaphors chosen, the ritual phrases used before a demand or an offer, these all signalled how you understood the relationship. If a coastal envoy described the Mexica, the people of Tenochtitlan, as our lords, Malintzin had to decide whether to render that literally to Aguilar, and through him to Cortés, or to soften or sharpen it. If Cortés responded by calling himself the vassal of a great king across the sea, how exactly did that become intelligible in Nahuatl? Was he a Tlatoani, a speaking lord? Something more? Something less? We will never have the exact words. All we have are Spanish letters describing their own rhetorical brilliance and indigenous accounts filtered through later recording, memory, and trauma. But everyone agrees on one thing. Very quickly, Malintzin moved from the background to the centre of almost every important conversation. The Spanish recognized her usefulness formally. She was taken from the general pool of enslaved women and given to Cortés himself. She was baptized, given the name Marina, and drawn into the small circle around the expedition's leader. Sources describe her sitting beside him in councils, speaking for him to indigenous envoys, and speaking for them to him. She became, in a literal sense, his voice. That meant that Cortés' threats were her words in Nahuatl. His promises were her promises. When he told a visiting delegation that he came in peace, but would respond to aggression with iron and fire, the emotional texture of that message, the confidence, the hesitation, the implied insult or the offered respect, rode on her choices, conscious or not. This is where the power of translation becomes something more than a mechanical relay. Translation is always interpretation. No two languages match exactly. Even common words carry different shades of meaning, different implied relationships. When Cortés demanded that a town submit to the emperor and to the true faith, what did that become in Malintzin's mouth? Submission to a distant yet to be imagined overlord? Alliance with a powerful new lord? A ritual acknowledgement of something that might never matter on the ground? Did she frame baptism as an additional god to honour, or as a replacement for all existing gods? Those differences shaped whether a local ruler thought he was making a temporary accommodation, entering an alliance of equals, or surrendering his autonomy. We can trace some of these nuances in the way later indigenous histories talk about her. In Nahua annals, she is sometimes described as a mediator who made things clear between Cortés and the lords he met. In others, she's portrayed as the one who reveals the secret speech behind the Spaniards' actions, interpreting not just their language but their intentions. And then there is the question of agency. Was she simply transmitting Cortés' will, trapped in a chain of events she could not escape, trying to survive in the only way available to her? Or did she actively shape the path of the conquest, by choosing which information to pass on and which to hold back, which rumours to emphasize, which dangers to highlight? The sources pull in different directions. Spanish writers tend to present her as loyal, almost miraculously so, a woman whose devotion to Cortés and Christianity made her a kind of honorary Spaniard. Indigenous sources are more ambivalent. Some emphasize her wisdom, her quick thinking, even a kind of shared authority, referring to Malintzin and Cortés as though they were a paired unit. Others, especially in later centuries, blame her for opening the way to disaster. Modern historians, looking at the fragments, tend to see a young woman with limited but real options navigating a world in which her linguistic skills suddenly gave her leverage, but also bound her tightly to a violent project. We know she warned Cortés of dangers more than once. At least 2 episodes hint that information moving through her mouth meant the difference between an orderly meeting and an ambush. On the Gulf Coast, as word of these newcomers spread inland, delegations arrived from towns that were both curious and afraid. Some bore gifts, some brought complaints about Mexica tribute collectors, some came to watch and report back. In those conversations, local elites quietly probed the strangers for weaknesses. They asked about their numbers, about their ability to fight at night, about their loyalty to each other and to their distant king. At the same time, Cortés used Malintzin and other intermediaries to ask his own questions. Who were the enemies of Tenochtitlan? Which towns along the road resented sending cloth, cacao, and warriors to the Mexica? Which Altepetl had old grudges against Tlaxcala, or Cholula, or Texcoco? This was intelligence gathering conducted sentence by sentence, through a woman who understood both the literal words and the political landscapes behind them. A pause, a hedged phrase, a reluctant admission about a hated overlord. She could hear those things and pass them on, or not, with all the small adjustments that come from being rooted in one world and pulled into another. Even rumours about the Spaniards themselves travelled through her. Stories that they could not be killed, that they were fulfilling prophecies, that they were allied with powerful gods. Some of these tales may have been indigenous interpretations of baffling technology. Some may have been deliberate Spanish propaganda, framed and circulated to encourage wavering towns to choose alliance over resistance. Either way, making those stories intelligible in Nahuatl required choices, which metaphors to use, which deities to compare them to, how much to lean into or away from the aura of the uncanny. And in the other direction, indigenous attempts to understand the newcomer's motives had to pass through her filter. When someone asked whether the Spaniards would leave after a season, or whether they meant to stay and rule, what exactly did she answer? Was the truth even clear to her? There are moments where words seem to have mattered as much as any canon. When emissaries from Moctezuma came to the coast bearing rich gifts and polite but firm requests that the strangers stay where they were and go no further inland, the entire encounter was verbal. No one drew steel, no walls were stormed. Instead, a great deal turned on how that message was framed. If Moctezuma's envoys spoke in the oblique, courteous language of central Mexican diplomacy, praising the guests, humbly suggesting what would be best, dressing a command in layers of metaphor, then Malintzin had to decide how to render that for a man like Cortés, who came from a culture that prized direct orders and clear defiance. A delicate discouragement could arrive in his ears as an insult, or as an expression of fear, or as a challenge. Likewise, his insistence on continuing inland could be softened for Moctezuma as stubborn curiosity, or sharpened into open threat. We know the outcome. Cortés did not turn back. Whether that outcome was inevitable is hard to say. But however firm his plans, hearing the Emperor's will through Malintzin's voice was part of how he gauged what he could risk. Later, in Tlaxcala and Cholula, there would be councils where dozens of local leaders listened not to Cortés directly, but to the woman beside him, speaking in their own language. Some of them were hearing a Spaniard for the first time. What they took away, the sense that these strangers were overconfident or vulnerable or divinely protected, or just another set of ambitious war leaders, came to them wrapped in her phrasing, her cadence, her instincts about how to be persuasive in a Nahua world. Over time, that constant presence left a mark. In some indigenous pictorial manuscripts, the symbol for speech, the curling scroll emerging from a mouth, appears not from Cortés but from Malintzin, even as the pair stand together. To the artist recording those events, she was the one who truly spoke. He acted, but she articulated. And yet, for all this, the record of her own thoughts is almost absent. We don't have letters from her, or confessions, or even reliable second-hand accounts of how she understood what she was doing. After the conquest, she bore Cortés a son and later married another Spaniard. She disappears from the documents not long after, her life folded into private domestic arrangements, while her symbolic presence in the story grew ever larger. Over the centuries, that absence became a canvas. Nationalist histories of an independent Mexico turned her into a symbol of betrayal, the woman who sold out her people. Feminist and indigenous reinterpretations have pushed back, seeing in her a survivor of enslavement who turned the one weapon she had, language, into a way of carving out space for herself and, perhaps, tempering the violence she could not stop. The truth is probably not neat. She was a teenager turned, almost overnight, into the linchpin of a deadly encounter between worlds. Her choices mattered. Her constraints mattered. Her words carried armies behind them. Without her or someone like her, Cortés would have been another armed intruder blundering along a hostile coast, dependent on guesses and pantomime. With her, he could talk. He could promise, threaten, mislead, and be misled. He could hear the cracks in the empire he was walking toward. Before there could be alliances, there had to be conversations. Before Tlaxcala could decide whether to fight the strangers or join them, before Cholula could be accused of plotting betrayal, before Moctezuma could weigh offers and omens, someone had to make the words travel. That someone, more often than not, was Malintzin. and the first great test of what those words could accomplish was waiting just inland, in a valley where the enemies of Tenochtitlan had been holding their ground for generations. Tlaxcala was not a village clinging to the margins of an empire. It was an island of defiance surrounded on almost all sides by Mexica power. In a landscape of tribute and submission, it had somehow remained unconquered. For generations, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan and their allies had tried to change that. Campaigns were launched, battles fought, fields burned, yet Tlaxcala remained independent, battered, encircled, but not absorbed. It was a small confederation, 4 main altepetl, 4 paired city-states bound together in mutual defence, living under constant military pressure. The roads around it could be dangerous. Aztec-aligned towns ringed its territory. Trade was restricted, ambushes were common, crop raids were frequent. And yet that pressure also gave Tlaxcala something rare, a clear sense of who they were not. While many central Mexican polities had folded into the tribute system, sending cloth, maize, warriors, jade, feathers, and more to Tenochtitlan, Tlaxcala sent nothing. That meant they had no access to the prestige that came from being inside the imperial network. But it also meant they had no imperial tax collectors, no garrisons, no Mexica governors imposing marriage alliances and religious obligations from above. In Nahuatl terms, independence had a price and a pride. Tlaxcala paid the price every planting season, wondering if Mexica warriors would descend on their fields. But they also held on to the pride, the memory of battles fought, the stories of generals who had bloodied imperial armies and come home alive. There's another layer here, half practical, half ritual. Some historians think the Mexica deliberately left Tlaxcala unconquered as a kind of permanent enemy, a reservoir of foes for the so-called flowery wars. Ritualized campaigns meant to capture prisoners for sacrifice and maintain military readiness. Others think the Mexica tried, failed, and later wrapped those failures in religious rhetoric. Either way, Tlaxcala lived in a state of almost permanent low-intensity war. Children grew up knowing that the empire to the west would always want their land, their bodies, or both. So when word reached Tlaxcala that strange warriors had appeared on the coast, with thunder weapons and armoured animals, it didn't arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a world where the question was never, will there be war, but with whom and under what terms? Cortés and his party, moving inland with Totonac allies already in tow, were not heading into friendly territory. As they approached Tlaxcalan lands, their previous conversations through Malintzin had done something subtle but crucial. They had identified Tlaxcala as a key node, a stubborn enemy of Tenochtitlan, a possible ally, or a deadly trap. The Tlaxcalan Council faced its own version of that decision long before they ever saw a Spaniard's face. Messengers brought conflicting rumours. The newcomers defeated coastal towns and yet did not immediately settle. They spoke of a distant king and a single god. They fought the Mexica's enemies and took the Mexica's tribute. They bled when cut, but their weapons killed at a disturbing distance, and everywhere they went they listened. They asked questions about Moctezuma, about tribute, about resentments. From Tlaxcala's view, this was suspicious. Who were these people really for? When Cortés crossed into Tlaxcalan territory, the first answer was simple and traditional. They were enemies. The Tlaxcalan lords chose to fight. The early battles were fierce and chaotic. Spanish accounts emphasized the waves of Tlaxcalan warriors, the brilliant cotton armor, the war cries, the banners. Indigenous accounts where they survive recall the shock of horses charging into close-packed ranks, the burning pain of gunshot wounds, the way steel blades sliced through shields and armor that had been perfectly adequate against obsidian and wood. For several days the Spaniards and their allies were harried, attacked, encircled. Numbers were not on Cortés's side. Without local support, he was a small, isolated group, deep inside a hostile network of towns that could mobilize thousands of fighters. But numbers weren't everything. Horses could break lines in a way no one in central Mexico had seen before. Dogs trained for war tore into fleeing warriors. Steel helmets and breastplates turned many blows that would have been fatal in any other conflict. And behind those strange weapons was something less visible, but just as dangerous. The willingness to fight to the death in an unfamiliar land because turning back had become politically impossible. As days passed and neither side could land a decisive blow, something began to shift, not just on the battlefield, but in the counting rooms and council houses behind it. Tlaxcalan leaders, watching from a distance and listening to reports, had to weigh new facts. These strangers did not break and run after the first bloody encounter. They did not melt into the countryside when food grew scarce. They kept marching, kept fighting even when outnumbered. And in every clash, the casualties were not evenly distributed. Tlaxcala's warriors were bearing the brunt. At a certain point, a question becomes unavoidable. Are we exhausting ourselves fighting people who could instead be used against our real enemy? The Spaniards were asking their own version of that question. Cortés could see his men tiring, his horses injured, his ammunition limited. He understood, perhaps dimly, perhaps more clearly than we like to imagine, that to reach Tenochtitlan he needed something far bigger than a few dozen Castilian lancers. He needed food, porters, scouts, and above all, warriors who knew every road and town between here and the lake. And so, somewhere in those days of battle and stalemate, both sides began to grope toward negotiation. The first feelers likely didn't come as grand envoys. They may have come as captured warriors spared on purpose, sent back with messages, as shouted offers between lines when fighting lulled for the night, as quiet suggestions from lesser nobles who had brothers and cousins in other towns. What if, instead of killing each other to the last man, we spoke? Whatever the precise sequence, we know the direction of travel. Cortés, through Malintzin and Aguilar, made a basic point. He had not come to conquer Tlaxcala. He had come, he said, to challenge the power of Tenochtitlan and spread the worship of his god and king. Tlaxcala, long oppressed by Mexica aggression, stood to gain if the empire fell. To Tlaxcalan ears this was both tempting and dangerous. Tempting, because the idea of turning the empire's own enemies against it must have sparked a fierce, almost joyful calculus. Dangerous, because aligning with unpredictable foreigners could end with Tlaxcala swallowed not by Tenochtitlan, but by something even harder to understand. The internal debates in Tlaxcala are invisible to us in detail, but we can infer their main lines from later accounts. Some nobles distrusted the strangers absolutely. Others saw in them the best opportunity in generations to break the siege that had defined their politics. There were probably generational splits. Older warriors with long careers fighting Mexica armies, younger men who could imagine commanding cavalry and cannon. There were likely religious questions. What did these men's gods mean? Was it wise to bring them closer? In the end, the council chose a path that balanced risk with possibility. They welcomed Cortés into their city. They offered provisions, quarters, and formal alliance. They demanded in return recognition of their independence and Spanish support against the Mexica. It was not submission, it was a bargain. That bargain transformed everything. Overnight, the Spaniards' numbers changed. Not in the sense that there were suddenly thousands of Europeans. It's unlikely more than a few hundred Spaniards ever set foot in central Mexico during these early campaigns, but in the sense that the expedition became a coalition. Tlaxcalan warriors joined under their own captains, wearing their own insignia, following their own chain of command. They did not become Spanish soldiers. The Spaniards became one more war band in a much larger indigenous army. Logistically, this meant secure food supplies, resting places on the road, local guides who knew which towns were likely to resist and which might be coaxed into alliance. Politically, it meant that Cortés no longer spoke only as a foreign intruder. He could present himself, even if only rhetorically, as the spokesman of a wider anti-Mexica front. From this point on, whenever we picture the march toward Tenochtitlan, we need to erase the image of a small, tight column of Europeans moving alone through hostile territory. The reality was closer to a moving city. Spanish infantry, mounted men, artillery, camp followers, enslaved people, allied warriors from Cempoala and other Gulf towns, and increasingly large contingents of Tlaxcalans. Tens of thousands of indigenous allies would eventually take part in the siege and the final battles. Many more fought and died in the skirmishes that led up to that moment. They were not a side note. They were the majority of the fighting force, the porters, the cooks, the scouts, the builders of causeways and siege engines. Spanish letters often minimize this, focusing on the courage of a few hundred Christians, but indigenous pictorial manuscripts show something different. Ranks and ranks of local warriors, with Spaniards as one more if peculiar element in the composition. The motives that pulled Tlaxcala into this alliance were layered. Revenge was one. Decades of Mexica raids and humiliation had built up an account that many were eager to settle. Survival was another. If the empire decided to launch a concentrated campaign with full resources, Tlaxcala might eventually be overwhelmed. Having terrifying new allies could deter that, or at least even the odds. There was also opportunity. If Tenochtitlan fell, the tribute flows of central Mexico would need new channels. Tlaxcalan elites could imagine themselves collecting cloth and cacao instead of surrendering them. They could picture new marriages, new vassals, a rebalanced map with Tlaxcala in a central, not marginal position. Some might even have entertained the idea that they could manage the Spaniards, use them briefly, and then, once the Mexica threat was broken, edge them out. And beneath those immediate calculations there was political leverage. Simply by aligning with the Spaniards, Tlaxcala could send a message to neighbouring towns and rival Altepetl. We are the conduit through which these dangerous strangers will move. Negotiate with us, or be bypassed and possibly crushed. In an already complex web of rivalries, the arrival of the Spaniards didn't erase old politics, it intensified them. Of course, alliances are not spells of permanent unity. The same motives that make them attractive, revenge, fear, hope for advantage, also make them fragile. What happens if the promised plunder doesn't materialize? If the Spaniards treat allies as subordinates rather than partners? If Tlaxcalans see other towns gaining more favour, more loot, more land? Even in these early days, under the surface of celebratory banquets and mutual oath-taking, those questions must have been whispering in council halls. Cortés needed Tlaxcala desperately. Tlaxcala needed what Cortés could bring. But both also knew that once the common enemy's fate was decided, their interests might diverge sharply. For now, though, the alliance held. The sleeping valley that had resisted the empire for so long opened its gates to the strangers and sent its sons to march beside them. With Tlaxcala at his back, Cortés could aim for something that only weeks earlier would have seemed suicidal: to walk into the lake city itself. The next stop on that road was a place famous for its temples, its rituals, and its careful diplomacy, a city that would become a warning to every other town watching these events unfold. Before Tenochtitlan, there was Cholula, and in Cholula the politics of fear would take a very different shape. Cholula was not the biggest city in central Mexico, but it was one of the most watched. From a distance, what you would have seen first was not palaces or markets, but the rise of a great artificial hill, layer upon layer of ancient construction, covered in temples and courtyards. The largest pyramid in the Americas wasn't a sharp-edged stone mountain like at Teotihuacan. It was a massive stepped platform built and rebuilt over centuries, its sides softened by time. Around it spread a dense patchwork of neighbourhoods, shrines and plazas. Every road that mattered seemed to pass near Cholula. It sat close to the crossroads between the Gulf Coast and the Central Plateau, between Tlaxcala and the route to Tenochtitlan. That geography gave it choices. It could not afford to be openly hostile to the Mexica, but it also did not want to become just another tributary town. So its rulers specialized in something else: religion and diplomacy. Cholula was famous as a sacred center, a place of pilgrimage. Merchants and nobles came from distant regions to worship at its temples, especially those dedicated to Quetzalcoatl in one of his local forms. Gifts flowed into its shrines. Priests and ritual specialists from other Altepetl studied there. That religious prestige translated into political leverage. If the gods favoured Cholula, then rulers elsewhere had to treat it carefully. When Cortés and his increasingly large coalition began moving in that direction, everyone knew it would be a test. To the Mexica, Cholula was an important ally, a kind of soft glove covering the harder fist of imperial power. Officially, it was not a conquered province. It was a friend who happened to align its interests with Tenochtitlan's, whose priests joined Mexica priests in shared rituals, whose markets helped move imperial goods. Unofficially, everyone understood that where Cholula went, others would follow. To Tlaxcala, Cholula was a neighbour that had made the opposite choice. While Tlaxcala had stood outside the imperial orbit, Cholula had worked within it. Relations were tense. Trade and intermarriage still happened, but under the surface lay resentment and rivalry. Now, with Spaniards in Tlaxcala's camp, that rivalry acquired new stakes. Walking toward Cholula, Cortés was not simply moving along a road. He was stepping into a space where religious prestige, imperial expectations, and local fears all intersected. The sources begin to diverge sharply at this point. They agree that something terrible happened in Cholula, a massacre that turned a holy city into a warning. They do not agree on exactly why. Spanish letters and later chronicles tend to tell a similar story. They say Cortés approached Cholula under peaceful terms. Envoys came out from the city. There were invitations, promises of hospitality. When the coalition entered, they were given quarters, assigned places to stay. Then, according to these accounts, whispers began reaching Spanish ears. Some Tlaxcalan allies claimed the Cholulans were stalling, that they were acting under orders from Moctezuma to kill the Spaniards once they were disarmed and scattered. Spaniards noted that food rations were small, that the city's leaders seemed evasive. There were rumours of pits dug in the streets, of stones piled on rooftops ready to be dropped, of warriors massing nearby. In these versions, Cortés learns of a plot at the last moment, seizes the local lords, and orders a preemptive strike to save his men. Indigenous accounts, where we have them, complicate this picture. Some later Nahua narratives, recorded after the conquest, say that the initiative for violence came from the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies, not from a Cholulan conspiracy. Cholula had ties to the Mexica, yes, but also its own interests. Its leaders faced immense pressure from Tenochtitlan to slow or divert the foreigners, to insist they take a different route, to display loyalty. That did not automatically translate into a desire to massacre the newcomers. In some retellings, Cholula's rulers hesitated. They tried to keep the Spaniards under surveillance, to limit their movements, to manage their presence the way they might manage any powerful visiting army. Politely, nervously, with an eye on both Tenochtitlan and Tlaxcala. That hesitation, from the Spanish perspective, could easily look like trickery. From Cholula's perspective, it might have been the only available balance between two terrifying options. We don't have a clear transcript of the final meetings in the city. We have only later reconstructions shaped by politics, fear, and hindsight. What we can say with some confidence is that violence in Cholula did not erupt in the heat of a marketplace argument or a sudden street fight. It was organized. Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces gathered the local nobles into a central space, called them to council, or to a ceremony, or to hear a speech. The details differ, but the structure is familiar from other conquest narratives. Invite, concentrate, and then attack. Once the signal was given, allied warriors fell on the unarmed or lightly armed Cholulans. Spaniards used steel blades and war dogs. Tlaxcalans used obsidian-edged weapons and fire. Temples and houses were set alight. People fleeing down narrow streets found exits blocked. Days later, the city still smoked. Numbers in the sources are almost certainly exaggerated. Some chronicles speak of thousands killed, others tens of thousands. Cholula was large, but even in the worst case the written figures strain credibility. Still, for those who survived, quibbling over exact totals would have meant little. A sanctuary had become a battlefield. A place known for pilgrimage was now known for slaughter. Why did Cortés allow or order such a thing? The explanations given at the time tell us as much about Spanish self-perception as they do about Cholula. In his letters, Cortés portrays the massacre as a kind of necessary surgery. He claims he uncovered a plot in which Cholulans, under Moctezuma's pressure, had prepared to kill the Spaniards and their allies. In this telling, the attack becomes self-defense, framed as an act to terrify opponents into submission while sparing those who did not resist. Later historians sympathetic to this view repeat the argument. He struck first to avoid extermination. But the same event can be seen through a different lens. Seen from Tlaxcala, Cholula represented a rival religious and political centre that had chosen alignment with the massacre. Destroying or crippling it would weaken the imperial network and send a message to other fence-sitters. Spanish steel and gunpowder made that suddenly possible. The Tlaxcalan contingent, eager to prove loyalty to their new allies and settle old scores, may have pushed for severity. In some oral traditions, the massacre has the flavour of long-delayed vengeance wrapped in foreign armour. Seen from Cholula, if we imagine the council halls before the attack, the situation looks even grimmer. The rulers were likely trapped between three dangers: offend the massacre by welcoming the strangers too warmly, offend the Spaniards and Tlaxcalans by being too cautious, or try to balance and risk pleasing no one. In systems where public rituals are deeply political, even small gestures, the order of processions, the wording of speeches, which gods are invoked first, could be interpreted as statements of allegiance. A misstep in that symbolic choreography might have meant death either way. Then there is the broader logic of terror. Whether or not there was a real plot in Cholula, the outcome served a strategic function. News in central Mexico travelled fast. Messengers ran, traders talked, pilgrims carried stories. Word that an allied Spanish Tlaxcalan force had entered one of the most sacred cities in the region and left it partially in ruins would have reached surrounding towns quickly. What did those listeners hear? They heard that these newcomers and their native allies were not hesitant to desecrate temples, kill nobles, burn houses. They heard that a city with long-standing ties to the empire had not been protected by those ties. They heard that Cortés could, in one violent gesture, punish a place that seemed to waver. Terror, in this sense, was not a side effect. It was a tool. By demonstrating extreme violence in one location, a commander can hope to avoid repeated smaller battles elsewhere. The unspoken offer becomes, submit, and we will treat you within certain bounds. Resist or play double games, and we will make you an example. Medieval and early modern European warfare was full of such calculations. Central Mexican warfare had its own versions, from ritual sacrifice of captured leaders to destruction of rebellious towns. Cholula became a moment where those traditions intersected. But terror has a double edge. The same act that convinces some to surrender can convince others that no surrender will ever be safe enough. If a holy city can be treated like this, what protections do oaths and rituals really offer? If foreigners and their allies can be so ruthless, maybe it is better to throw one's lot entirely with the empire, or to plot more carefully, or to delay in subtler ways. The massacre at Cholula did not simply cow everyone into submission, it also deepened an atmosphere of suspicion. From that point on, when envoys from smaller towns met the Spanish-led coalition on the road, they were no longer just weighing tribute obligations or dynastic rivalries. They were also remembering the stories of Cholula, the lords called to council, the closing of exits, the flames. The question in their minds was not simply, should we resist? But if we welcome them, will that protect us or paint a target on our backs? In the written chronicles, moral ambiguity is often smoothed over. Spanish authors emphasize providence. God allowed the massacre to punish idolaters and open the way for the true faith. Indigenous nobles writing decades later, already living under colonial rule, sometimes echo that logic in Christianized language, framing the fall of places like Cholula as part of a divine plan or as deserved punishment for past arrogance. Others more obliquely preserve the bitterness, songs that mourn broken temples, pictorial codices that show flames and falling captives without accompanying sermons. When we read these sources, we have to listen for what they are not saying directly. No one involved wanted to portray themselves as the villain of the story. Cortés and his supporters needed the massacre to look justified, even righteous. Tlaxcalan elites needed to portray their participation as a necessary step in liberating themselves from Mexica aggression, not as opportunistic bloodletting. Later, Christianized writers needed to reconcile the horror with the belief that events had unfolded under a just God. So the massacre becomes, in their narratives, a regrettable but inevitable act, made necessary by Cholulan treachery or by Moctezuma's hidden hand. The victims become, in some texts, faceless instruments of a larger plot rather than individuals caught in an impossible situation. Yet underneath the justifications sits a simpler, uncomfortable reality. Everyone was increasingly afraid of everyone else. Moctezuma had reason to fear that his allies might defect under pressure. Tlaxcala feared that if the Spaniards failed, imperial vengeance would be total. Smaller towns feared picking the wrong side. The Spaniards feared betrayal in every city they entered because they were few and far from home. In that climate, rumours of ambushes and conspiracies did not need to be fully true to have real consequences. They only had to be plausible enough to tip decisions toward preemptive violence. Cholula marks a turning point in that spiral. Before, the newcomers could still be imagined in some places as potential partners who might move through without overturning everything. After, it was harder to maintain that hope. The edge of the conflict sharpened, and yet, even after the smoke cleared, negotiations did not stop. Surviving nobles in Cholula made terms. The city did not vanish. It shifted position in the new order taking shape. Nearby towns watched and adjusted their own strategies. Some edged closer to the Spaniards and Tlaxcalans, seeking favour and protection. Others reaffirmed loyalty to Tenochtitlan, trusting that Moctezuma's resources would eventually outweigh the shock of foreign weapons. For Cortés and his allies, Cholula sent another kind of message as well, one directed not at indigenous audiences but at themselves. It showed that their coalition could, in a matter of hours, break a major urban centre aligned with the empire. It reinforced the idea that decisive, overwhelming violence, handled at the right moment, could change the political map more quickly than months of cautious diplomacy. As they left the damaged city behind and turned their faces toward the lake basin, that lesson would travel with them. So would the mistrust they had amplified. Moctezuma, in his island capital, heard about Cholula too. He heard that his ally had been humbled, that its temples had burned, that its people had bled while he did not move an army in their defence. He heard that the strangers were no longer just foreigners on the coast, or guests in Tlaxcala, but men who had walked into a sacred city and made it an example. When the messengers finished their reports, the gap between fear and decision narrowed. Whatever he did next, invite them in, bar the causeways, negotiate from the shore, would be chosen under the shadow of Cholula. From the ridge above the Valley of Mexico, the lake basin did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a mirage. A broad sheet of water shimmering in the sun, broken by causeways and artificial islands, villages and fields floating where in other places you would expect bare shoreline, and in the middle of it all, lifted out of the lake like a vision, the city of Tenochtitlan. The coalition coming from Cholula would have first seen it at a distance. Pale temples rising over the haze, the straight lines of causeways running like stone ribbons across the water. For the Spaniards, this was unlike anything they had seen in Europe. For the Tlaxcalans and other central Mexican allies, it was familiar but still awe-inspiring. Tenochtitlan was not just another city. It was the axis around which their world turned. As they descended toward the basin, the air changed. Cooler, slightly damp, carrying the smell of water plants and wood smoke. The causeways grew larger in their vision, no longer thin lines but broad engineered roads, solid enough to carry armies. Each causeway had bridges that could be removed. Each had guard posts and shrines. Passing on to one was not merely a practical step, it was entering the emperor's space. Along the way, there were smaller towns, some on the lake edge, some partly in the water. Canals cut through neighbourhoods. Canoes slid past each other, piled with firewood, maize, woven mats, live birds in cages. You could walk the causeway and still feel like you were moving through an aquatic marketplace. Voices carried over the water. Dogs barked from Chinampa fields. Drums pulsed faintly from distant temples. The closer they came, the more structured everything became. The causeways narrowed in places, funneling the procession. Temple platforms and minor shrines flanked the road, each one a point where watchers could observe who was entering and in what order. Messengers ran back and forth carrying word ahead. No step, no rest stop was invisible. By the time Cortés and his allies neared the city gates, Moctezuma had heard multiple versions of how they were approaching. Who marched first? How many horsemen? How many Tlaxcalans? What banners they carried? Inside Tenochtitlan, the emperor's world was already in motion. He was not just weighing the news as a curious observer. He was sitting at the center of a densely woven web. Every decision he made sent ripples outward, to tributary towns watching his firmness, to internal factions measuring his strength, to rival Altepetl calculating whether it might be time to shift alliances. The massacre at Cholula had not simply terrified him, it had exposed him. If he barred the causeways and tried to keep the coalition out, he risked an immediate confrontation. If he moved his armies openly, he signalled to allies that he believed the newcomers were strong enough to fear. If he did nothing, he risked looking weak, especially to those who already resented tribute and dreamed of defection. He was also a religious figure. As Tlatoni, his legitimacy ran through the gods. Omens, portents, ritual obligations were not side matters. They were part of the job description. The empire did not separate sacred and political spheres the way later European writers might. For Moctezuma, every political calculation had a ritual surface, and every ritual act carried political meaning. Later sources tell elaborate stories about what filled his thoughts as the strangers approached. They speak of ominous comets, monstrous birds, burning temples, voices in the night. They describe Moctezuma as a man crushed under the weight of prophecy, convinced that a long-promised lord was returning from the east. These accounts, written after the fact, are tricky. Some were shaped by Spanish chroniclers who wanted the conquest to look like the fulfillment of destiny, not a contingent military and political process. Others were recorded from Nahua informants living in a colonial world, where framing the fall of Tenochtitlan as inevitable, even God-planned, made a certain sense. There very likely were unusual events that people interpreted as omens. Central Mexican ritual life put enormous value on reading signs in the world. Lightning strikes, unusual births, strange animal behavior, astronomical phenomena. It is also plausible that some priests and councillors argue that the arrival of the strangers matched existing stories of past cycles and returning powers. But whether Moctezuma truly believed Cortés was a god or a returning ancestor is far from certain. The language of divinity and lordship in Nahuatl is layered. Terms that Spanish ears translated as god could also mean powerful ruler, sacred being, or simply someone who occupies a high ritual office. What we can say is that Moctezuma was trying to balance at least three pressures at once. First, the pressure of realpolitik, an armed, unpredictable foreign force carrying unheard-of weapons, had just demonstrated in Cholula that it could overturn a major city allied to the empire. Second, the pressure of internal politics. Noble houses within Tenochtitlan and neighbouring Tlatelolco watched his response closely, as did the rulers of Texcoco and Tlacopan, his co-rulers in the Triple Alliance. Third, the pressure of ritual cosmology. Whatever he did had to be framed as consistent with the will of the gods and the proper maintenance of the cosmos, so he chose a move that tried to serve all three. He invited them in. On the causeway, the coalition encountered a carefully staged series of meetings. Delegations of nobles, priests, and officials came out to greet them, bringing flowers, garlands, incense, food. Each encounter was part welcome, part inspection. Who took the gifts? Who spoke? Did the foreigners step aside when asked or push forward? Were their native allies deferential enough? When finally Moctezuma himself came into view, the choreography intensified. Contemporary Spanish accounts describe him carried on a litter, nobles sweeping the ground before him so that his feet would not touch bare earth, attendants shading him. Nahua recollections emphasize the richness of his garments, the strict protocol that no one look him directly in the face, the hush that fell around him as he moved. This was not just personal vanity, it was a form of statecraft. The emperor's body was a symbol of imperial order. To display him in full ritual dignity was to remind everyone, Spaniard, Tlaxcalan, local villager, that they were entering a world whose hierarchy had been carefully constructed and ritually reinforced over generations. The meeting on the causeway, often retold, was likely more layered than the surviving speeches suggest. Spanish texts preserve set pieces where Moctezuma flatters Cortés and hints at ancient prophecies, while Cortés replies with pious humility and talk of the Christian God and the distant king of Castile. These speeches, as we have them, were mediated through multiple interpreters and later polished into literary form. They tell us more about how later authors wanted the scene to sound than how it actually unfolded word by word. Still, beneath the rhetoric, certain things were probably clear. Moctezuma offered gifts, precious cloaks, gold, feathers, food, the standard tools of welcoming and also of soft control. In this world, to accept a gift was to enter a relationship. It could signal willingness to be hosted, to become a guest who owed certain forms of obedience. Cortés, in turn, accepted the gifts but refused the implicit limit. The stories have him saying he must continue farther, must see the city, must speak more and stay longer. So the procession entered Tenochtitlan. Crossing into the city was like stepping into a new order of density. Houses lining canals, their walls bright with whitewash and paint. People crowding onto rooftops, into doorways, along causeways, drawn by curiosity and fear. Markets that other travellers had already called the largest they had ever seen, filled with traders from distant provinces. Here, goods from across the empire changed hands. Cacao from the south, cotton cloth from the warmer lowlands, obsidian blades from distant quarries. Food from a web of chinampa fields that made the lake surface itself a cultivated landscape. Everywhere, eyes. Hospitality in Tenochtitlan was never simple. When Moctezuma led his guests to their quarters, palaces that had housed earlier rulers, he was not simply being generous. Housing them in royal compounds placed them at the centre of his surveillance network. They were surrounded by walls he controlled, supplied by kitchens he staffed, attended by servants whose loyalty lay with him. The Spaniards were impressed by the luxury. The emperor was reassured by the boundaries. Those boundaries were made of protocol as much as stone. Food arrived in abundance, but it arrived according to ritual schedules. Visits took place in formal spaces, under the gaze of officials trained in reading posture and tone. Information was offered, but also curated. The newcomers saw what the emperor allowed them to see. Or so, from the imperial side, it must have seemed. From the Spanish perspective, things looked different. They walked through a city larger than any they had imagined in the Indies, full of people whose language they did not speak without intermediaries, ruled by a man whose gestures and symbols they did not fully understand. They were acutely aware of how few they were. They noticed the removable bridges across canals, the massive temple precinct that could serve as both monument and fortress, the warriors stationed casually near important sites. They accepted Moctezuma's hospitality, but they did not trust it. They explored as far as they were allowed. They tested boundaries, sending small groups to look at markets, temples, armories. Tlaxcalan and other indigenous allies moved through the city too, carrying their own impressions back to Spanish ears, who seemed nervous, which quarters were heavily armed, what the common people were saying. Each side believed it was managing the other. Moctezuma may have thought that by drawing the strangers into his city and honouring them lavishly, he could keep them under close watch, display overwhelming urban splendour, and, at the right moment, either neutralise them or fold them into his system as exotic but ultimately dependent vassals. To let them remain in Tlaxcala or on the fringes would have left them in a looser network of alliances beyond his direct reach. Cortés, on the other hand, seems to have believed that by entering the heart of the empire he could reach for the lever that moved everything else. If he could understand this emperor, sway him, intimidate him, or control him, then tributary towns might shift more easily. The logic was risky but familiar from European politics. Seize or influence the sovereign, and the realm may follow. All of this unfolded under a layer of mutual misreading. Symbols that seemed obvious to one side were ambiguous to the other. When Moctezuma stepped down from his litter to meet Cortés, did he signal extraordinary respect, or careful control of ritual space, or both? When Cortés embraced him, did he appear friendly, or shockingly informal or sacrilegious? The same object, a gift of gold, a feather headdress, a Christian image shown as a token of faith, could mean different things depending on who received it. A reassurance in one system could look like a veiled threat in another. Inside the lake city, for a brief period, this delicate balance held. Guests walked the marketplaces and marvelled. Hosts maintained forms of courtesy that masked deep unease. Guards watched from rooftops. Priests burned incense and observed the strangers' devotions with their own quiet assessments. And beneath the ceremonies, the same question pulsed on both sides. Who, exactly, was holding whom? Were these foreigners lodged at the mercy of an emperor who could, at any moment, cut the causeways and close the city's fists around them? Or was the emperor, in welcoming them into his own palace, placing his person within reach of men who were already thinking in terms of hostages and decisive strikes? No one yet knew the answer. But the way they entered Tenochtitlan, the causeways, the gifts, the protocols, had already begun to shape what answers would soon be possible. The answer for Cortés did not stay unknown for very long. Once inside the city, the gap between appearance and fear widened with every day. On the surface, things looked almost peaceful. The Spaniards and their allies occupied royal quarters. Food arrived regularly. Moctezuma visited, spoke through Malintzin, listened to Cortés's explanations about the Christian God and the distant king he served. But underneath the arithmetic was terrifyingly simple. Fewer than 200 Spaniards, several hundred indigenous allies, surrounded by tens of thousands of warriors in a city whose streets, canals and rooftops could all become weapons. Cortés had seen enough to know that if Tenochtitlan decided to close its hand, the foreigners would vanish. So his mind reached for a tool that was familiar from his own world. In Iberian politics, in Italian wars, in the Mediterranean between Christian and Muslim states, hostage-taking was not just cruelty, it was a method. Seize a prince, a governor, a bishop, and you did not have to defeat an entire army to paralyze a state. You could freeze decision-making at the top, force negotiations, bend behavior without openly claiming to rule. He began to think of Moctezuma not as a host, but as the key piece on the board. Spanish chroniclers later wrapped his decision in a story. They said Cortés heard that Aztec officials had attacked a coastal garrison and killed some Spaniards. They said he used this as a pretext, marched to the palace, and told Moctezuma he must come quietly to the Spanish quarters for his own safety, while everything was sorted out. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the underlying logic is consistent. As long as the emperor sat on his own throne, surrounded by his own guard, the Spaniards were exposed. If the emperor's body could be moved into their sphere, behind their walls, the entire balance of risk might change. From a distance, this might sound suicidal. They were a tiny force trying to lay hands on a ruler whose very person was sacred, in the heart of his own capital. But hostage-taking did not require overwhelming strength. It required surprise, audacity, and a very precise bet that the shock of the act would be so great that institutions would hesitate long enough for the new reality to harden. That hesitation is what Cortés was really buying. When the moment came, it seems to have been carefully staged. Spaniards arrived armed but polite, cloaked in a language of concern. They spoke of unrest, of misunderstandings, of enemies outside the city who might target Moctezuma. Coming with them, they said, would prevent confusion, prove friendship. Malintzin's role here would have been crucial. The tone of her voice, the framing of the request, the exact verbs and honorifics chosen in Nahuatl could make the difference between an invitation and a threat. The sources agree on one surprising fact. Moctezuma went. He did not call the guards to arms. He did not barricade himself in the sacred precinct. He stepped down from his position and walked, under Spanish escort, into the palace compound that already housed his guests. Later writers turned this into a morality tale. Some described him as paralyzed by prophecy, too afraid to act. Others painted him as fatally indecisive, the opposite of the warrior kings who had come before. Both images say as much about the needs of those later narratives as about the man himself. In the logic of his own world, though, the move may not have looked like simple surrender. High lords sometimes moved between palaces. Ritual seclusions and strategic retreats into particular precincts were part of elite politics. By going, Moctezuma may have hoped to buy time too, to avoid a bloody clash in the sacred heart of the city, to keep negotiations alive, to prevent an incident from spiralling out of control while he still believed these strangers could be contained. What neither he nor his nobles could fully foresee was how profoundly the symbolism of that walk would reverberate. Because when the Tlatoani allowed himself to be physically relocated, the entire web of institutions around him quivered. In Aztec political life, power did not flow only from one man. There were councils of nobles, military orders, priestly colleges, local rulers of subordinate towns. But the emperor's person anchored that system. His presence in the great temple precinct, his appearance in ceremonies, his voice issuing commands in his own palace. These were the visible signs that order held. Once he sat behind foreign walls under foreign eyes, everything became unclear. Could decrees issued from his mouth still carry the same weight? If he addressed the people from the palace roof, was he speaking as a sovereign, or as a man speaking with a spear point just out of sight? This ambiguity was exactly what Cortés needed. By holding Moctezuma as a kind of honoured prisoner, the Spaniards created a vacuum without announcing a revolution. They did not proclaim themselves rulers of the city. They did not abolish the old structures. They simply inserted themselves between the emperor and his own world. The psychological effect was enormous. Nobles arriving to seek guidance now had to pass through foreign guards. Messages travelling to and from tributary towns now ran a gauntlet of interpreters and watchful Spaniards. Decisions that once would have been routine, whether to mobilize troops, how to respond to minor revolts, what rituals to perform in response to bad omens, were now tangled up with the question of what the strangers might do to their captive if they disliked the answer. It was a form of paralysis that did not require chains. Hostage-taking in this sense worked less by brute force than by uncertainty. If you believe that any decisive move might condemn your ruler to death, you hesitate. If you are not sure whether his words are freely chosen, you delay acting on them. Every day of hesitation is another day the hostage-takers can fortify their position, gather intelligence, and make themselves harder to dislodge. Inside Tenochtitlan, this hesitation spread like a fog. Some nobles, especially those closest to Moctezuma, tried to adapt quickly. They continued official business as if nothing had changed. They delivered tribute, they oversaw markets, they met with Spanish officers, offered gifts, listened, probed. It was not only fear that guided them, it was also the hope that the crisis might be contained, that this strange arrangement could be temporary, that the Tlatoani could eventually return to his proper seat with minimal bloodshed. Priests faced a different kind of crisis. The emperor was not only a political anchor, but a ritual one. Certain ceremonies required his presence or his sanction. The captive ruler could still authorize rites, still speak the words, but the spatial disruption. A Tlatoani lodged in a foreign-occupied palace, under constant watch, could not help but feel cosmically wrong to people whose world was built around correct placement and timing. Some sources hint at debates among the priesthood. Were these strangers a test sent by the gods, an opening into a new cosmic cycle, or were they a pollution that risked angering the deities if not removed? Every sacrifice, every incense offering took place under that shadow. Military leaders, for their part, had to coldly calculate. They knew very well that they could not simply ignore a foreign force holding their ruler. Warriors drilled. Weapons were readied. Plans were whispered. If it came to it, could they storm the palace, kill the Spaniards, rescue Moctezuma? Could they cut the causeways, starve the intruders, break them down by siege? Yet each of those options carried the one unbearable risk. If an assault went wrong even for a moment, the foreigners might kill the emperor out of panic or strategy. For many, that was a price too high to contemplate. So preparations continued in the background, but the decisive blow did not fall. The city waited. This waiting did not mean calm. On the streets, in the markets, on the rooftops, people talked. They saw their emperor walking under guard. They saw Spaniards moving more confidently, posting lookouts, bringing in more supplies. They watched Tlaxcalan and other allied warriors, traditional enemies, walking inside their city with a new swagger, sheltered by Spanish patronage. Loyalties began to shift along lines that were not always visible at the top. Some local rulers, especially those from towns resenting tribute or recent conquests, may have thought, if the emperor is weakened, perhaps my people can gain more autonomy. Perhaps these strangers can be used, as we ourselves are being used, to break the pressure from Tenochtitlan. To them, the captive ruler was not just a tragedy, he was an opportunity. Others reacted in the opposite way. For those deeply invested in the imperial structure, this sight of Moctezuma under foreign watch was a humiliation that burned. The more he appeared in public accompanied by Spaniards, the more his image changed, from unapproachable lord to compromised figure. Resentment began to shift from fear of the newcomers to anger at the arrangement itself. Cortés's position depended on riding these cross-currents without being thrown. He had no solid base in the city except the palace he occupied. He did not command the causeways. He could not draw on endless reinforcements. His security rested on two fragile pillars: the continued cooperation of Moctezuma and the continued deterrent power of fear. Fear, in the first phase, came from shock. The massacre at Cholula, the horses, the unfamiliar weapons had created an aura of unpredictability and danger. No one was quite sure what these strangers were capable of or what their limits were. That uncertainty made caution feel wise. But fear has a half-life. As days passed without another public atrocity, as people watched Spaniards eat, pray, fall ill, quarrel among themselves, they stopped looking entirely like supernatural instruments. They started to look more like men. Dangerous, yes, but not invincible. To keep fear effective, Cortés sometimes made deliberately theatrical moves. Spanish sources describe him ordering punishments for Aztec officials accused of plotting, carried out under Moctezuma's eyes, as if to demonstrate both his control and his willingness to act. Whether every detail of these stories is exact or not, they point to a consistent strategy. Stage enough violence to maintain deterrence, but not so much that the city erupts into immediate revolt. Meanwhile, his dependence on Moctezuma grew deeper. He needed the emperor to issue orders for supplies, to calm nobles, to discourage open resistance. He needed him to stand on palace rooftops and address crowds, to tell them that for now they should remain at peace, that these guests were under his protection, that the world had not yet turned upside down. Every time Moctezuma did this, he preserved lives in the short term. He also chipped away at his own aura. To some of his subjects, a ruler who urged patience while foreigners held him closely began to look less like a protector and more like a man speaking with someone else's hand at his back. The tension built quietly, in layers. On one layer, formal meetings continued, courtesies were exchanged, gifts moved. On another, military preparations multiplied just out of sight. Warriors counted foreigners, noted guard changes, mapped the palace walls in their minds. On yet another, rumours braided through the city. Stories of Spaniards eating gold, of their armour hiding animal skins, of strange diseases that followed them. In this charged atmosphere, every small incident could take on enormous weight. A Spaniard insulting a noble, an allied warrior overstepping in a neighbourhood market, a misinterpreted order from the emperor. Any of these might become the spark that showed whether paralysis would continue or shatter. For now, though, the city held its breath. An emperor sat in his own capital, but not in his own house. Foreigners slept within walls that were both shelter and trap. Priests watched the skies and wondered what cycle of the sun they had entered. Warriors tested obsidian blades on practice targets, waiting for a word that did not come, and in the centre of it all, the leverage that had seemed so decisive, the captive ruler, was slowly turning into something else, a fuse, burning silently toward an explosion that neither side could fully predict. While that fuse burned in the lake city, another kind of fuse was being lit far away on the Gulf Coast. News in this world did not travel by letters alone. It moved in the mouths of sailors, the boasts of soldiers, the complaints of merchants. Somewhere in the tangled channels of the Caribbean, word had reached Cuba. Hernán Cortés, sent out to trade and explore, had instead marched inland, defied orders, seized a foreign emperor and begun acting like a man who meant to carve out his own domain. For Velázquez, the governor of Cuba and Cortés's formal superior, this was more than disobedience. It was a direct threat. If men could sail under his commission and then ignore his authority once they struck rich land, his power was an illusion. So he reached for the bluntest instrument he had. He assembled another expedition. More ships, more guns, more horses. A commander whose loyalty he trusted more than Cortés's, Pánfilo de Narváez. When Narváez's fleet dropped anchor on the same coast where Cortés had first landed, it was not as reinforcements. It was as a moving accusation. He came with letters branding Cortés a rebel, with legal documents stripping him of command, and with enough force to make those papers feel heavy. Somewhere between 800 and 1,000 Spaniards, depending on the chronicle. More artillery, more crossbows. In purely European terms, this was overwhelming superiority. The effect on Cortés, once he heard, was immediate and chilling. Inside Tenochtitlan, he had built his entire strategy on a single assumption, that the small group of Spaniards in the city represented all the Spaniards that were going to come, at least for the near future, that their risky hostage game and delicate balancing act were the only possible path. Now, with Narváez's arrival, a new possibility appeared, one that could be even more dangerous than anything the Mexica might do. If Narváez succeeded in arresting or killing Cortés, he would inherit everything. The alliances with Tlaxcala, the knowledge of the routes inland, the hostage emperor. But he would not inherit Cortés's exact web of promises and threats, his personal relationships with Malintzin and other key translators, his own specific understanding of just how thin his position was. Narváez might march on Tenochtitlan with raw confidence, thinking he led the lawful, larger, better-armed force. He might try to take control from the existing garrison by force. From the perspective of the city's elites, this would look like what it was. Spaniards fighting Spaniards, their internal rivalries spilling over into the valley. An imperial crisis could rapidly become something more like a civil war among the invaders, fought in the narrow streets of Tenochtitlan itself. For Cortés, this was not a distant administrative quarrel. It was an immediate threat to his survival. The emperor in his palace was one danger. But a rival Spaniard on the coast, claiming legal authority and backed by cannon, was another. Between the two, he could be crushed like an insect between grinding stones. So he made a choice that reveals just how precarious his situation truly was. He left. He took a portion of his already small force out of the heart of the empire, away from their hostage and their fortified compound, and marched back toward the coast to confront Narváez. It is worth pausing over how strange this looks from a distance. Here is a man who has just walked into one of the greatest cities in the world, who is vastly outnumbered, dependent on the uncertain goodwill of tributary enemies and a captive king. And into this already razor-thin balance, he introduces a voluntary split of his own forces. In purely military terms, it was madness. But Cortés was not playing a simple military game. He was reacting, improvising, managing layers of threat that pulled in different directions at once. If he stayed in Tenochtitlan, Narváez could consolidate on the coast, cut off supplies, declare Cortés an outlaw, and move inland with fresh men who had never seen the dangers of the valley and were eager for loot. If Cortés left in force, he risked his foothold in the city. If he left in weakness, he risked everything. So he chose a middle path, one that signaled both his vulnerability and his way of turning vulnerability into an opportunity. He left behind a garrison under Pedro de Alvarado, hot-tempered, ambitious, already known to the Mexican nobility and commoners alike as a man dangerous in ways different from Cortés. He left them with Moctezuma, with a city watching, with tensions taut. Then he turned and marched out with roughly half his Spaniards and thousands of indigenous allies, moving back along the causeways, back through towns that were still calculating where their interests lay, back toward the sea. This march tells us something about supply and about how fragile European presence in this new world remained. The Spaniards had no deep logistical base in Mexico, no chain of fortified depots, no secure ports stocked for years. Their line of support was basically a line of memory and obligation, strung along villages and towns that had, so far, decided not to kill them. Every bag of maize, every jar of water, every porter, they all depended on keeping that unstable agreement intact. Now the line had to serve two masters, the party in Tenochtitlan under Alvarado, with a captive emperor to feed and watch, and the party on the march with Cortés, heading toward an enemy who spoke their own language and knew their own tactics. It was a kind of stress test for the entire enterprise. Could their fragile alliances and half-built networks carry that weight? On the coast, Narvaez thought he knew the answer. He had numbers, he had ships, he had fresh horses that had not yet been worn down by long inland campaigns. His men had not spent months breathing the thin air of the high plateau or navigating causeways ringed by watchful eyes. Their world was still mostly the one they knew: sand, palms, the reek of ships' holds and the crack of European discipline. He tried to use the tools of that world first. He sent letters. He offered pardons to any of Cortés's men who would come over to the lawful side. He hinted that wealth taken under a rebel commander might be confiscated, that honours granted by an outlaw might be stripped. If Cortés himself would surrender, perhaps he could be forgiven. If not, the full machinery of Spanish law and royal authority would grind him down. Cortés answered with a mixture of humility on paper and cold calculation in action. He played for time. He wrote letters that stressed his loyalty to the king, his devotion, the necessity of his actions. He painted the inland world in colours meant to unsettle Narvaez's men. Vast cities, countless warriors, dangers that would require unity rather than rivalry. Meanwhile, quietly, he probed Narvaez's army the way he had probed the Mexico world, by testing loyalties, looking for fractures, dangling promises. Many of Narvaez's soldiers had come for what all of them came for: glory, gold, land, some path out of the cramped hierarchies of Iberia. When they heard rumours that Cortés's followers had already seen a city built on water, had walked streets lined with goods beyond anything in the Caribbean, had touched stores of gold in palaces no European king had yet visited, their certainty wavered. Perhaps the rebel was not a wild gambler, but a man with a head start. The clash came not as a grand open battle, but as something closer to a night raid. Cortés moved fast under cover of dark and storm, hitting Narvaez's camp before the larger army could fully deploy its advantage. Confusion, fire, shouting in the rain, horses slipping in mud, cannon crews trying to work in chaos. Somewhere in the struggle, Narvaez was struck in the face, lost an eye, and was taken prisoner. With that, the battle changed from a contest of arms to a negotiation with men whose commander was now in chains. Cortés did what he had done again and again in this campaign. He turned enemies into assets. He offered Narvaez's men what they had come for: shares in future spoils, promises of land, a cut of whatever treasure might lie in Tenochtitlan. He presented his version of events, in which he alone had led Spaniards into the heart of a great empire, in which he alone knew the balances to be kept and the taboos to be avoided. One by one, in groups, then as an almost complete mass, Narvaez's soldiers changed sides. In a stroke, Cortés's manpower multiplied. He went from the captain of a desperate expedition to the leader of nearly every Spaniard in the region. But this sudden abundance carried its own dangers. These were not hardened veterans of mountain marches who had already stood on Tenochtitlan's causeways. They were newcomers. Many had never seen the valley. Few understood the precarious threads holding Cortés's previous alliances together. Most had no deep relationship with Malintzin or other indigenous intermediaries. Their expectations were sharper than their caution. They had walked into Mexico with the scent of easy victory in their nostrils. Now they were being told that the true wealth lay inland, under the shadow of pyramids, in a city where another group of Spaniards sat, armed and uneasy, in a foreign palace. Politically, too, the absorption changed the landscape. Velázquez's authority was broken in practice, if not yet in law. There was no longer an obvious rival Spanish power on the coast. The governor's attempt to reassert control had backfired, creating not a divided field, but a single swollen force under the man he most wanted to restrain. Cortés's rebellion, such as it was, had effectively been ratified by the choices of hundreds of soldiers who voted with their feet and their swords. Yet every one of those extra mouths needed food. Every horse needed fodder. Every gun needed powder and shot that could only be replenished by ships watching weather and currents no one fully controlled. The campaign, swollen, became even more dependent on uncertain supply lines running over sea and land, on the goodwill or resignation of people whose language most of these men did not speak. And in Tenochtitlan, the vacuum Cortés had created by marching away did not stay empty. Alvarado, left as commander, was not Cortés. He did not share the same instinct for calibrated intimidation, the same sense of how far to push without breaking. He'd seen what terror could do at Cholula, and the memory of that success may have shaped his choices. The nobles and priests around Moctezuma, feeling the emperor's presence dimming behind foreign walls, were making their own calculations. Rumours from the coast filtered in, twisted by each retelling. Some said a great Spanish force had landed to crush Cortés and free the emperor. Others whispered of quarrels among the strangers, without the one man who had woven together the fragile accommodation, without the voice that had learned painfully how to speak just enough Nahuatl through Malintzin to make demands sound like negotiations. The margin for misjudgment narrowed. Ceremonies approached on the ritual calendar, including festivals that required public gatherings, music, dancing, the unsheathing of weapons in sacred space. In another year, under another sky, these might have passed like any other. In this charged season, with foreigners inside the sacred precinct, each step in the ritual cycle carried latent danger. On the causeways, lookouts watched the horizon for dust clouds that might mark the return of Cortés and whatever forces he had gathered. Inside the palace, Alvarado watched the city through a narrower lens, his fears and assumptions shaping each order. Priests prepared for Toxcatl, the festival of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, the god of fate and reflection. Warriors honed blades and practiced steps that were at once dance and battle training. The campaign from the Spanish side still had no master plan. It lurched forward through improvisation, with each new crisis forcing a choice that opened one path and closed others. Confronting Narvaez had solved one problem but deepened another. More Spaniards meant more strength on paper, but also more arrogance, more pressure to deliver spoils quickly, less patience for the slow, ambiguous politics Cortés had been practicing in the city. Somewhere in the overlapping zones of fear and expectation, among a nervous garrison in a foreign-occupied palace, a priesthood determined to keep the ritual order, and newly arrived soldiers hungry for proof that tales of gold were real. The spark that would shatter the tense equilibrium was already forming. It would not come from a royal decree or a carefully weighed strategy. It would come from a moment in which one man's sense of threat collided with another group's sense of sacred duty. For now, though, as Cortés turned back inland with hundreds of newly sworn followers, burdened with prisoners and promises, Tenochtitlan moved inexorably toward that moment. Music rehearsed for a festival, armor polished in a palace courtyard, supply lines stretched thinner over mountains and through forests, and between city and coast, between captor and captive, between rival Spaniards now forced into a single uneasy camp, the last fragile threads keeping peace from breaking were fraying one by one. Toxcatl was not a small thing that could be postponed or quietly cancelled. It was one of the great pivots of the ritual year, a festival at the centre of how the Mexica understood time, power, and their relationship to the gods. The god at its heart, Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was not a gentle figure. He was fate and conflict, temptation and kingship, the one who could raise rulers up and strip them down to nothing. In some traditions, he and Huitzilopochtli were almost twinned aspects of power. To honour him properly was to keep the balance of the world. To fail was to invite misfortune on a cosmic scale. Preparation for Toxcatl took an entire year. A young man, chosen for his beauty and bearing, lived as the living image of the god, treated with honour, taught to play flutes, and carry himself with grace. He walked the city veiled in flowers, women and nobles bowing before him. Everyone knew how his story would end. On the day of the festival, he would climb the steps of the great temple, break his flutes one by one, and be sacrificed. His death, in this logic, renewed the world. Around this drama unfolded a broader celebration. Music, dances in full war regalia, offerings of flowers and food, the great gathering of warrior societies inside the sacred precinct. For the Mexican nobility, Toxcatl was part devotion, part public affirmation of their identity as a people of war and ritual order. For the commoners watching, it was reassurance that the machinery of the cosmos was still turning, the gods still being fed. Trying to hold such a festival with foreign soldiers inside the ceremonial heart of the city was like trying to perform heart surgery, while someone leaned on your shoulder and asked if they could borrow the scalpel. Still, accounts suggest that negotiations were made. According to some indigenous and Spanish sources, the Mexican nobles sought permission from Alvarado to hold the dances, to dress in their finest, to bring drums and song into the courtyard of the Templo Mayor. They may have promised to leave weapons aside to keep the event peaceful. Alvarado, perhaps trying to show a measure of toleration, or simply confident that he commanded enough force to control things, agreed, at least at first. The details diverged sharply after that. In one version, told by later Spanish chroniclers, including Cortés's own allies, Alvarado acted preemptively because he believed a plot was forming. He claimed that the warriors gathering for Toxcatl meant to use the festival as cover for an attack, to fall upon the small Spanish garrison, slaughter them, free Moctezuma, and sweep the foreigners out of the city in a single blow. If this was what Alvarado truly believed, Toxcatl did not look like a religious event. It looked like a dagger hidden in a bouquet. In Nahuatl accounts recorded decades later, the emphasis is different. They describe warriors and nobles, unarmed or lightly armed, coming to dance in costumes glittering with gold, feathers, and precious stones. Drums beat, songs rose, the celebration moved through its ordered stages. The Spaniards, they say, waited until the dancers were deep in the ritual, their focus turned inward, their bodies moving in carefully rehearsed steps. Then, on a signal, they blocked the exits and began to kill. Those Aztec narrators describe it in terms that still feel raw. Heads split open, arms hacked off as men tried to shield themselves, gold and jewels torn from bodies even as they fell, blood pooling on polished stone that had for generations been washed clean, after sacrifices done in an entirely different frame of meaning. This was not the orderly flow of hearts to the gods, it was chaos. Between these versions lies a fog of fear, misunderstanding, and perhaps calculation. It is entirely possible that Alvarado heard some fragment of talk among the nobles, interpreted it through his own memories of Cholula, and decided that he would not wait to be surprised. It is also possible that no serious plot existed yet, that the Mexica elite were using the festival to show continuity and unity under watchful foreign eyes, to remind everyone, Spaniards, allies, and commoners, that ritual power still pulsed in the city. We may never be able to separate the exact trigger from the justifications invented afterward. What matters for the story that followed is simpler. Inside the sacred heart of Tenochtitlan, during one of its most charged ceremonies, Spaniards and their allies killed dancing nobles in large numbers. The scale of the slaughter is also contested. Some sources speak of dozens, others of hundreds. The precise count is less important than who died. These were not random bystanders. They included members of high warrior orders, men of stature and lineage. In a society where political power, military prestige, and religious duty were woven together, cutting down such figures in consecrated space was more than a crime. It was a tear in the fabric that held the world together. Outside the temple precinct, ordinary residents of Tenochtitlan heard the drums. At first, the steady rhythms of Toxcatl songs. Then a different sound, drumming that signalled alarm, cries. The rumour mill, always active in a dense city, began to spin at full speed. Messages ran from courtyard to courtyard. The Spaniards have begun killing the dancers. The nobles are dying. The festival has been desecrated. In some tellings, people speak of seeing streams of blood running down the temple steps, of bodies thrown aside like refuse. Whether or not every detail is literally accurate, the emotional truth is clear. The sense of outrage, of sacrilege, spread faster than any messenger could run. Inside the palace where Moctezuma was being held, the sound reached the emperor as well. Imagine, as far as we can, what that might have felt like. For months, he had tried to manage this spiraling crisis by keeping violence contained, by accepting personal humiliation to prevent wider war. Now, in one stroke, much of that strategy had been smashed. Trust, already thin, already strained by rumours of Cortés's departure and battles on the coast, collapsed. The careful distinction many Mexica had been making between Cortés, who might be dangerous but useful, and other Spaniards who were less-known quantities, blurred. To people staring at dead relatives on the temple floor, all the foreigners in metal became one thing: killers of dancers, profaners of ritual. From that moment, restraint became almost impossible. Every faction inside the city, priests, nobles still alive, commoners, even Moctezuma's own relatives, had taken a wound that could not be bandaged with words. The emotional temperature leaped. Grief and anger mingled with fear. If they could do this in the middle of Toxcatl, in broad daylight, what would they do next? Crowds have a physics of their own. Stories, once launched, accelerate. Some people may have shouted that the Spaniards meant to kill everyone, that they planned to tear down the temple, that Moctezuma himself was already dead. Others may have urged patience, calling for messengers to go and see. But in a city of tens of thousands, shock does not dampen evenly. It flashes through marketplaces, workshops, canals. It gathers at choke points, gatehouses, bridges, the edges of the temple square. Political calculations that the previous day had required long councils and careful speech now compressed into snap judgments. Men who had hesitated to oppose the emperor openly found themselves pushed forward by the tide of popular fury. Those who had wanted to negotiate with the Spaniards suddenly looked like collaborators. In that mental space, calls for compromise become hard to voice without risking your own neck. The Spaniards inside the palace compound would have felt the shift almost immediately. The mood of people in the streets, the way porters and servants looked at them, the sudden thinning out of voluntary suppliers. Where there had been wary curiosity, there was now a hard, flat hostility. Strategically, their position had always been precarious. They occupied a single complex in a vast city, linked to the outside world only by a few causeways stretching over water and marsh. Now, with news of the massacre racing from neighbourhood to neighbourhood, those causeways began to feel less like roads and more like traps. Barricades could appear overnight, bridges could be cut, canoes could swarm under the causeway arches. Every alley might hide a warrior with a sling or a spear. The Spaniards had steel and gunpowder. The city had numbers, local knowledge, and a reason now to use them without holding back. The dynamic inside the palace also changed. Moctezuma, whose presence on the roof or at the gate had previously been enough to calm a crowd, saw his authority evaporating in real time. When he tried to speak to his people in the days after Toxcatl, urging them to keep peace, to let the strangers live, the insults that came back were new: coward, puppet. You have allowed our warriors to be butchered. From the perspective of many in the city, the sacred contract between ruler and ruled had been broken twice over. First, when Moctezuma had allowed himself to be confined rather than die fighting. Second, when, under his watch, the Toxcatl ceremonies had ended in massacre. A king whose very legitimacy derived from his role as guardian of ritual order had presided over its shattering. In that atmosphere, the Spaniards' numbers, swelled by Narvaez's captured troops who were now trickling into the valley, did not feel like an advantage. They felt like extra mouths trapped in a box, extra bodies that needed space on the walls, extra horses that had nowhere to run if the city decided to close its fists. Alvarado, facing this storm, tried measures that had worked before. Shows of force, sorties into nearby streets, the display of captured nobles. But what had intimidated allies and enemies at Cholula now worked differently. Tenochtitlan was not a tributary city on uncertain footing. It was the heart of an empire, humiliated and enraged on its own ground. Each attempt by the Spaniards to secure food or seize vantage points risked clashes. Each clash produced fresh dead, new reasons for vengeance, more stories to feed the collective memory. The child struck by a stray bolt, the woman trampled by a horse, the warrior who managed with a stone to crack a helmet. The geography that had initially impressed the Spaniards, the narrow causeways, the bridges that could be raised, the houses built over water, now turned against them. They were, in effect, besieged inside a city that had once welcomed them as honoured guests. Their allies from Tlaxcala and other regions huddled with them behind the same walls, hearing their own names cursed in Nahuatl outside. Step by step, what had been a tense coexistence tipped into open conflict. The massacre at Toxcatl was not the only cause, but it was the hinge. Before it, there was still room, however narrow, for a future in which Spaniards and Mexico coexisted under some negotiated order. After it, the emotional and symbolic damage was so great that such futures became almost unimaginable. Tenochtitlan itself began to feel different. The same streets, the same canals, the same markets, all were now traversed by people who carried a new, sharper edge in their thoughts. Craftsmen who had previously admired Spanish metalwork now pondered how to pierce it. Women who had traded food to foreign soldiers now spat curses at the mention of their names. Children listened to adults speak not of omens and uncertainty, but of war. A city that had welcomed, then watched, was now preparing to resist. The great lake that had once dazzled the strangers with its reflected light would soon become a battlefield. But first, the men who had caused this rupture had to face the immediate consequences of their actions. Inside the palace, surrounded, running low on safe avenues of supply, the Spaniards sent desperate messengers along the causeways, trying to reach Cortés wherever he was on the road back from the coast. They had won a battle against Narvaez. In doing so, they had created a new, larger army. Now they needed that army not for conquest, but for escape. While those messengers slipped through the tightening net by night, Tenochtitlan continued its transformation. The songs of Toxcatl had been silenced. In their wake came different rhythms, the thud of timbers dragged to block streets, the murmur of war councils, the hiss of obsidian blades being sharpened against stone. The world, as people in the valley had known it, its fragile balance of fear, awe, and negotiation, had cracked. Through that crack, something harsher was already beginning to emerge. Cortés did come back. He marched in from the east with his swollen force of Spaniards and coerced recruits, entered the valley again, and saw at once that the air had changed. Smoke rose from places that had not burned before. Patrols of armed men watched the causeways with a focus that had been missing months earlier. The little rituals of welcome, gifts of food, polite speeches in the name of Tenochtitlan were gone. When he finally pushed his way back into the city and into the palace complex, the reunion was not triumphant. It was grim. He found Alvarado's garrison exhausted, on edge, their horses reduced by wounds and lack of fodder, their powder spoiled in part by damp. The storehouses they had once relied on for maize and meat were nearly empty. The servants who had scurried to and fro with food now appeared rarely, if at all, and always under watchful eyes. Outside the walls, Tenochtitlan had moved from anger to action. Bridges on the causeways had been altered, some deliberately weakened, others removed and replaced with structures that could be dropped in an instant. Warriors had taken up positions in canals and on rooftops. Canoes had been brought into hidden inlets, ready to strike from below the walkways. The city that had seemed like a marvel of engineering now revealed its other face, a fortified labyrinth. Inside, Cortés tried to rebuild the pattern that had once worked. He brought Moctezuma out to speak to his people, to calm them, to promise that things could still be resolved. But this time, the spell did not work. Stones flew. Words sharper than obsidian cut through whatever thread of loyalty still held. Someone among the crowd hurled a missile that struck the emperor. Some sources say it was a stone, others mention a dart. Whether the wound alone killed him or whether Spanish hands finished the work remains one of those questions historians still argue over quietly in their books. What seems clear is that the Mexica ruler died soon after, under foreign guard, never again walking freely through his own city. With Moctezuma gone, the last thin bridge of legitimacy snapped. The Mexica named a new leader, Cuitlahuac, a seasoned warrior with no interest in accommodation. The fighting grew tighter around the palace. Skirmishes at the gates turned into constant pressure. Arrows, darts, and stones fell in a steady rain. Supplies dwindled further. Horses grew weaker. Men who had once thought themselves conquerors realized they were in fact besieged. At that point, the basic calculus turned. Staying meant starving, exhausting powder and crossbow bolts, watching allies die one by one. It meant waiting for the city to close in the last gaps, to build ramps and towers, to take the palace by storm. Some Spaniards may have argued for holding out, trusting that steel and discipline could withstand any number of attackers. Others, with a more practical eye on the dwindling piles of food and ammunition, saw that every day spent in the city made the eventual disaster worse. Tlaxcala and other native allies, crammed into the same courtyards, must have added their own voices. This was not their home ground. They had no emotional reason to die defending a Mexica palace that now felt like a killing pen. So the decision slowly congealed into certainty. They had to leave. Not in a leisurely procession, not with banners and fanfare, but in the most dangerous way an army can move, retreating at night through enemy territory, along narrow paths where a single break in the line could mean annihilation. The geometry of Tenochtitlan made this choice a nightmare. The city lay in the middle of the lake, connected to the shores by causeways, long straight roads of earth and stone pierced at intervals by openings for water flow. Each opening was originally spanned by removable bridges. In peaceful times, those bridges allowed canoes to pass and water to move. In war, they were perfect choke points. Remove them, and an enemy was forced to halt, rebuild under fire, or plunge into dark water. By the time Cortés and his commanders began planning their escape, many of those bridges were already gone or compromised. The Mexica understood their own infrastructure intimately. They had watched Spanish movements for months and could easily anticipate the likely routes. In effect, every causeway had multiple built-in ambush sites, and the defenders controlled the timing. They could let a column move out, then close in behind and in front, turning a straight road into a trap. Still, the alternatives were worse. The Spaniards could not fly. They could not tunnel. They had no fleet of boats capable of carrying horses, artillery, and hundreds of men at once. The causeway remained the only viable path, even if it was a path lined with blades. On a night often described as rainy, though some sources are less specific, they moved. The plan in outline was simple. Slip out under darkness, cross the causeway toward the mainland, and link up with friendly or at least neutral territory beyond the lake. The execution was anything but simple. They had to bring the wounded who could not be left behind without sentencing them to torture and death. They had to carry what food remained. They had to move their artillery and the heavy iron guns that had given them so much advantage in open battles. And then there was the treasure. Months inside, the city had not left the foreigners indifferent to gold and jewels. They had accumulated vast amounts of precious metal, ornaments, and ceremonial objects. Some of it had been seized openly, some extracted under pressure, some offered as part of Moctezuma's attempts to placate his guests. Now, on the eve of flight, chests and sacks of gleaming wealth sat inside the palace. For hardened soldiers far from home, the temptation to take as much as they could carry was strong. Some commanders may have urged restraint, arguing that speed mattered more than enrichment. Others, flushed with the memory of battles won and convinced they would return in strength, must have thought, why leave what can be borne away? In the end, many men, including allies assigned to carry loads, shouldered gold and silver alongside weapons and supplies. It slowed them, and the weight would matter in ways they could not yet imagine. They slipped out, according to the majority of accounts, in the dead of night. Cloaks dark, torches minimal, the column stretched along the causeway. Horses clopped softly on the damp surface. Wheels creaked, feet splashed in shallow puddles. For a time, the plane seemed to be working. They passed the first gaps, spanning them with a portable bridge constructed for the purpose. Timbers and beams, carried by strong men, laid down, crossed carefully, then lifted and pulled forward to the next opening. But darkness is not the same as secrecy, whether through spies, watchers posted on temple roofs, or simply the noise of hundreds of bodies on the move. The Mexica learned of the escape quickly. War drums sounded, conch shells blew, canoes that had been waiting in the canal slid out like teeth from gums. Warriors grabbed shields and weapons that had been kept ready by their sleeping mats. The city woke into battle. Somewhere along the causeway, as the Spanish Tlaxcalan column stretched thin, the balance tipped. Sources differ on exactly which gap became the fatal one, but the pattern is consistent. The portable bridge jammed or broke under the crush of people and animals, or it was captured and held by Mexica fighters. The front of the column, already across one opening, kept moving. The middle bunched. The rear became exposed. Behind them, more warriors were pouring onto the causeway from the city. Beside them, the lake filled with canoes. At that moment, the structure of the retreat collapsed. Order turned to confusion. Men in metal armor pressed forward, driven by fear of the pursuing enemy. Those burdened with gold or leading horses hesitated at the lip of the open water. Some tried to wade through, misjudging the depth. Others were pushed or fell. Horses, terrified and blind in the dark, stumbled, screamed, and went down. Heavy chests and sacks tore free and slid into the lake. The water beneath the causeway arches became a deadly tangle of bodies, armor, and equipment. A falling man could drag down 3 others. A horse could pin 2 or 3 beneath its flailing hooves. Warriors in canoes jabbed upward with spears, grabbed drowning enemies, and pulled them into boats to be taken as captives. Arrows slashed down from the sides. Stones and darts rained from rooftops at the cityward end. The causeway that had seemed like a narrow road now felt like the edge of a cliff. This is where the human cost becomes almost impossible to narrate in full. Spaniards died, many of them veterans who had survived earlier campaigns in the Caribbean and on the mainland. More numerous still were the indigenous allies, Tlaxcalans and others who had wagered their lives on this alliance, and now found themselves cut down or swept away in the company of their foreign partners. Some estimates, based on later reconstructions, suggest that thousands of native allies perished that night, along with a significant portion of the Spanish force. What had been built over months, relationships, promises, hopes of shared victory, was being shredded in hours by water and obsidian. Not everyone died on the causeway, of course. Some managed to fight their way across gaps, scrambling over makeshift bridges of fallen bodies and gear. Others abandoned treasure, cut loose from trapped wagons, and focused on survival. A few swam or were pulled to the side and made their way along the muddy edges of the lake. The column that staggered onto the mainland on the far side was not the confident army that had entered Tenochtitlan. It was a battered remnant, soaked, bleeding, many of them half-armed, with haunted eyes, and the memories of comrades vanishing under black water. Whatever gold they still carried felt different now. It was heavier, stickier, associated not with dreams of estates in Spain, but with the faces of friends dragged down into the lake. Later stories, especially in Spanish retellings, would focus on this, on men who drowned because their armor and greed weighed them down. It is a moralizing image, easy to remember. But beyond that cautionary tale lies a more complex truth. The escape had cost them not just treasure, but experience, trust, and the illusion of invincibility. In the days that followed, they could not rest long. Mexica forces pursued them, harrying the retreating survivors across the causeways and onto the mainland fields. At Otumba, they would fight a desperate battle that just barely kept the retreat from turning into total rout. Hunger gnawed at them, wounds festered. Some horses, already weakened, died. The psychological shock may have been worse than the physical injuries. Men who had believed that a handful of steel-clad soldiers could always break native armies now had the sound of that night lodged in their minds. The crash of collapsing bridges, the roar of drums, the screams from the water. Their native allies carried their own scars. Tlaxcalan leaders counted their dead and weighed the wisdom of continuing to support men who had brought them into such ruinous danger. And yet, when Cortés and his remnant finally reached Tlaxcala, starving and shaken, they were not killed or turned away. The decision to shelter them, to rebuild alliance rather than sever it, would shape everything that followed. But it was made in the shadow of La Noche Triste, with full awareness of the cost that standing with the Spaniards could entail. For the Mexica, the night was at once a victory and a warning. They had proven that the strangers could be hurt badly, that the lake and the causeways could be wielded as weapons. Yet they had also seen that even after such a blow, the enemy did not simply vanish into the water. A portion escaped. Some captives were taken, yes, but the core leadership survived. The Empire's warriors had tasted the effort it took to drive them out, felt the losses on their own side, and glimpsed how ferocious resistance could be when steel and horses were cornered. When both sides looked back on that night in the months ahead, a similar lesson unfolded from opposite angles. Tenochtitlan would not fall cheaply. The city's defences, its layout, its people's willingness to fight in their own streets and canals, all of this had blood price etched into it now. For Cortés, that realization meant abandoning any dream of simply walking back in and taking control through palace intrigues and hostage emperors. If he was to return, he would need something different. Ships on the lake, more allies, more time, and a strategy not based on being honoured guests but on systematic siege. For the Mexica, the lesson whispered the same truth in another tongue. They had driven out the invaders once, but not annihilated them. Those who escaped would remember, and they would adapt. The Night of Sorrows, as the Spaniards later called it, was also a night of revelations. It showed both conquerors and defenders the real scale of the struggle ahead. Not a quick confrontation decided by omens and first impressions, but a grinding contest of endurance, logistics, and will. In the weeks that followed, as the wounded limped, as survivors recounted the events again and again in Tlaxcalan courtyards and Mexico war councils, morale and hunger became as decisive as swords. The Spaniards, now outside the glittering lake city, had time to brood on their losses. Their fear hardened into determination. Their allies, mourning, argued among themselves but ultimately chose to fight on, not out of love for their foreign companions, but out of their own deep hatred of Mexica domination, and a hope that, even after La Noche Triste, some new balance of power could emerge. The city on the lake, meanwhile, began to prepare for the possibility that the strangers would someday return not as guests in a palace, but as besiegers on the water. They had won a night of blood, but the war was not over. La Noche Triste had illuminated for everyone involved the shape of the conflict to come. It would not be decided by one dazzling stroke or one bold negotiation. It would be decided by who could feed their people longer, who could build and rebuild after loss, and who, in the end, could bear the cost of trying to hold or to break an empire built on a lake. When the battered survivors reached Tlaxcala and collapsed into whatever shelter they could find, the struggle seemed, for a moment, purely human. Wounds from obsidian, fevers from infection, hunger from weeks of hard marching. Men coughed, groaned, and drifted into uneasy sleep. Tlaxcalan healers and Spanish surgeons tended to them as best they could, with herbs, cautery, and prayers. But along with steel and gunpowder, the foreigners had brought something else, something no one on that plateau could see or understand. It moved faster than armies and slipped through every crack that war opened. Somewhere in those camps, in the weeks after La Noche Triste, a body broke out in pustules. We don't know the exact patient, or even the exact village. Later Spanish chronicles point to a single person, often described as a black slave from Narvaez's contingent, who had supposedly survived smallpox in the Caribbean and carried the virus with him, invisibly, across the sea and inland. It's a neat story, easy to retell. One man, one disease, one empire doomed. but reality was probably more tangled. Spanish expeditions moved constantly between coasts, towns, and ports where Caribbean and European diseases already circulated. Soldiers who had been in Cuba mixed with new arrivals from Spain, who mixed with indigenous people from earlier campaigns, who then mingled with Tlaxcalans and with messengers moving between cities. Any number of contacts could have sparked that first chain of infection. What matters is not the name of the first victim, but the conditions that allowed the disease to flourish. The people of central Mexico had no evolutionary memory of smallpox. Their immune systems had never encountered it, never learned its tricks. In the Old World, smallpox had been circulating for centuries, perhaps millennia, killing some, scarring others, quietly selecting for those with just enough resistance to survive. In Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia, society had, in a grim way, co-evolved with it. Outbreaks were still terrifying, but they were woven into the fabric of life. In the Valley of Mexico, this virus arrived like a new kind of fire on dry grass. When smallpox hits a population with no prior exposure, the pattern is brutal. Children are especially vulnerable. So are elders. But in a true virgin soil epidemic, even those in their physical prime can die in shocking numbers. Not everyone, not half of everyone, but enough that villages hollow out, lineages break, and every family has empty mats. Exact figures are impossible. Later estimates talk about thirds of populations lost, sometimes more, sometimes less. These numbers are probably rough impressions layered with hindsight, shaped by Spanish chroniclers and later historians trying to make sense of catastrophe. What we can say, carefully, is that the first waves of smallpox and other Eurasian diseases caused mortality on a scale that would have felt apocalyptic to those living through it. Not a single bad year, but a tearing of the social fabric. In the months after the retreat from Tenochtitlan, as Cortés licked his wounds and rebuilt alliances, that tearing began. Illness almost always travels along lines of contact: trade routes, diplomatic visits, markets, pilgrim paths. The Mexica had woven the Central Highlands into a dense network of tribute and communication. Messengers went out with news of war, calls for warriors, instructions for local governors. Refugees from La Noche Triste moved too, carrying their stories and their bodies into other towns and Altepetl. In their wake, something microscopic rode along. Within Tenochtitlan itself, sources describe a period not long after the expulsion when disease appeared, spreading from household to household, from causeway to neighbourhood. The great market of Tlatelolco, that beating heart of commerce, must have become a conduit. Buyers and sellers came together in tight crowds. Someone coughed. Someone touched a contaminated blanket, a shared drinking vessel, a child's toy. The virus did what viruses do. The symptoms, once they began, would have been horrifying: high fever, pain. Then the rash, the eruption of small hard bumps that grew, filled with fluid, and spread. People could be marked from head to toe. In societies that prized cleanliness and careful grooming, this sudden disfigurement must have felt like a spiritual as well as physical assault. Caregivers came close, as caregivers always do. Parents tended to children. Siblings wiped brows. Priests visited the sick. Each act of compassion became another link in the chain of transmission. The Mexica and their neighbours were not unfamiliar with disease. They had their own illnesses, their own medical traditions, their own explanations. But smallpox did not fit neatly into existing patterns. It could sweep through a town regardless of omens, regardless of ritual observance, regardless of class. Nobles died, warriors died, skilled artisans died. For an empire whose stability rested on tightly organized tribute, specialized labor, and a carefully managed hierarchy, this unpredictability struck at the core. Leadership was especially vulnerable, not because the virus targeted them, but because of how society was structured. High nobles, priests, generals, these people traveled, attended councils, discussed war and tribute in closed rooms. They shared food, ceremony, and obligations, moving through the densest social networks. A disease that thrives on contact could move through those circles with ruthless efficiency. One of the most consequential losses, at least from both Spanish and Mexica perspectives, was that of the Emperor Cuitlahuac. Moctezuma's successor, The man who had organized the resistance and the expulsion of the Spaniards seems to have died within a few months of taking power, almost certainly during the first wave of smallpox. His rule was measured not in years, but in moons. Spanish accounts, written later, emphasize this death heavily. In their telling, smallpox snatched away the most capable Mexica war leader, just when the empire needed him most, leaving a vacuum filled by a younger, less experienced ruler, Cuauhtémoc. It's a tidy narrative, illness as a kind of hidden ally. Reality again was probably more complex. Cuitlahuac's ability to consolidate power after Moctezuma's controversial death was still in question. Factions within the nobility might have been contesting his authority even before disease struck. But his sudden disappearance in the midst of crisis undeniably deepened instability. Leadership losses rippled outward. Each High Lord had his own circle of advisors, captains, tribute administrators. If one died, succession could be contentious, especially in a moment when traditional procedures were already under strain from war. Multiply this across dozens of towns and dependent polities, and the administrative map of the empire began to blur. Even where leaders survived, their attention was divided. Instead of focusing entirely on military strategy or diplomatic maneuvering, they had to manage funerals, mourning rituals, and the raw grief of their people. In many Mesoamerican societies, death was embedded in religion, in prophecies, in conceptions of cosmic cycling. But the speed and scale of loss in a virgin soil epidemic can overwhelm even the most robust spiritual frameworks. Priests suddenly find themselves officiating at ceremonies every day. Families barely finish mourning one relative before another falls ill. Grief is not just an emotion. It uses energy. It occupies time. It complicates decisions. When almost every household is touched, large-scale coordination becomes more fragile. All of this intersected with something else. Food. Siege conditions, even when intermittent, create stress around supply. After La Noche Triste, Tenochtitlan was not immediately encircled, but the rhythm of tribute and trade had been disrupted. Surrounding enemies were not just hostile. Some of them were now actively sheltering and arming the Spaniards. Farmers in contested regions had to decide whether to keep sending grain and produce to the lake city or to hedge their bets. Some channels of distribution slowed, others broke. Disease and food insecurity feed each other. Malnourished bodies are less capable of fighting infection. Sick farmers cannot plant or harvest. Canoe traffic that used to carry maize, beans and chili peppers now also carried the virus. A shortage in one district could push desperate people to move, spreading infection further. The city that had once been fed by a remarkably complex and efficient network of chinampas, canals, and tribute flows now found those lifelines fraying just as illness struck hardest. From the Spanish perspective, as preserved in letters and later chronicles, smallpox often appears as a kind of providential turning point. Writers close to Cortés framed the epidemic as an act of divine favour, a punishment visited on the idolatrous empire. In these accounts, the disease weakens Mexican resistance at precisely the moment when the Spaniards need time to regroup, build ships, and reassemble their coalition. The narrative flows smoothly. First, La Noche Triste, then a miraculous disease that clears the way for ultimate victory. Indigenous accounts, where they survive, tell a more intimate, less triumphal story. Nahua annalists writing in the decades after the conquest describe waves of sickness in terms of unbearable suffering. Bodies covered in sores, people unable to move, entire households lying incapacitated. They write of hunger alongside illness, of abandoned houses, of streets quieted not by peace, but by exhaustion. The emphasis is not on divine judgment in favour of one side, but on the sheer weight of loss. It's important not to let either storyline, European providence or a single disease explaining everything, flatten the complexity of what was happening. Smallpox did not march alone into the Valley of Mexico and topple an empire by itself. It arrived in a landscape already cracked by political tensions, resentments among subject peoples, recent military defeat, and logistical strain. Without Tlaxcala and other indigenous allies, without Spanish cannon and cavalry, without the strategic use of the lake itself in the coming siege, the epidemic alone might have led to something very different. A weakened but still existing Mexica state. A temporary contraction of power, perhaps a reconfiguration of tribute relationships. Disease magnified existing fractures. It did not create them from nothing. At the same time, to ignore the epidemic would be to miss a quiet but decisive part of how the balance shifted. In any prolonged conflict, the side that can replace its losses faster, that can keep its leaders functional, that can feed its people and maintain social coherence, holds a crucial advantage. Smallpox struck at each of those pillars in the Mexica sphere at a moment when they could least afford it. Cortés's forces, too, suffered from illness. Some Spaniards caught smallpox, though many had childhood immunity. Indigenous allies living alongside them, equally unprotected by prior exposure, were also hit. But the shock waves inside the core of the Mexica system, the imperial capital and its closest tributaries, were uniquely destabilizing, because so much had been built around the unbroken authority of Tenochtitlan. As months turned into a year after La Noche Triste, both sides were changing. The Spaniards and their allies were building something tangible: brigantines, alliances, supply chains. Inside the lake city and across its tributary network, something more invisible was unfolding. Generational lines cut short, command structures distorted, fields untended, markets thinned out. From a distance, to later historians, the conquest can look like a string of battles and negotiations. Up close, in the days when people counted their dead and tried to understand why their skin burned and blistered, the war was also happening at the level of fevers and rashes, of who could still stand up and carry a spear or paddle a canoe. By the time Cortés was ready to return to the shores of the lake with his rebuilt army and his new ships, the battlefield he approached was not the same one he had fled. The causeways were still there. The temples still rose above the water. The Mexica was still fierce, organized, and determined to defend their home. But beneath the visible geometry of stone and canal, the city's human landscape had been altered. The tide had not turned with a single battle cry. It had turned slowly, silently, in sick rooms and crowded houses, in fields left untilled. When the siege truly began, it would be fought not only between walls and on water, but against the accumulated effects of a year in which both war and disease had been gnawing at the foundations of an empire built on a lake. The first time Cortés had marched into the Valley of Mexico, he'd moved like a raider. Fast, opportunistic, always looking for leverage, a surprise entry along the causeway, an audacious seizure of the emperor, a massacre at a festival to decapitate the city's leadership. That kind of warfare depends on shock and on the illusion of invincibility. It works as long as people believe you can do almost anything and escape. La Noche Triste shattered that illusion. The lake had swallowed men and horses and cannon. The causeways had turned into killing corridors. The empire had shown it could hurt the invaders badly. After that night, the old script, hostages, bold marches, quick terror, no longer made sense. The Mexica knew the tricks now. They understood what Spanish weapons could do and what they couldn't. They had already seen that an emperor in chains did not mean a city on its knees. So when Cortés thought about returning to that lake, he couldn't just think about how to get in. He had to think about how to keep the city from breathing. What emerged over the next months was something different from raids and ambushes, something harsher and more methodical, a siege. Not a medieval castle siege transplanted whole onto a Mexican lake, but a new kind of operation improvised from old-world concepts and new-world realities. Instead of one violent entry, there would be weeks of pressure, cutting, starving, isolating. The goal was no longer just to terrify the Mexica into surrender. It was to make it physically impossible for Tenochtitlan to function. The lake was the problem. The lake was also the answer. Tenochtitlan and its sister city Tlatelolco sat on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. joined to the shore by long, raised causeways. Those causeways had made the first conquest attempt possible. They gave horses and cannons a road. They turned water into something that could be ignored, at least for a while, as long as bridges were intact and allies guarded the flanks. During La Noche Triste, the Mexica had taught the Spaniards what happened when those narrow strips of land were no longer safe. Break the bridges, attack from canoes on both sides, and the causeway became a trap, a place where armour weighed you down and the water pulled you under. If Cortés wanted to close his fist around the city, he couldn't rely on those roads alone anymore. He had to become, in some limited way, a power on the water. That is where the brigantines come in. The word sounds simple. Small oared sailing vessels, a type already familiar in Mediterranean warfare. But getting European-style ships onto a highland lake more than 2,000 metres above sea level was not simple at all. There were no shipyards on the shores of Texcoco, no convenient forests of the right kind of timber, no dock workers trained to build hulls in the Spanish fashion. What Cortés had instead were instructions, iron fittings, and tens of thousands of indigenous hands. Sometime after the grim retreat, while rebuilding his alliances and nursing his reputation back to life, Cortés arranged for shipwrights on the coast to pre-build the structural components of several brigantines, keels, frames, planking, then disassemble them. These skeletal ships, reduced to labelled pieces, began a second life as cargo. Each beam and nail had to travel inland along mountain roads, already strained by war, carried on the backs of porters who had never seen an ocean-going vessel before they were asked to haul it, piece by piece, toward an inland sea. Spanish chroniclers like to dwell on the ingenuity of this operation, the cleverness of building ships far away and reassembling them later. But the real story lies in the scale of indigenous labour and knowledge that made it possible. Tlaxcalan and other allies felled local trees for additional wood and for the timbers needed to construct slipways and docks. They cut roads, built storage sheds, and moved supplies. Craftsmen accustomed to building temples and causeways adapted their skills to new shapes. Curved ribs instead of straight lintels, hull seams instead of stone joints. Nahua and other central Mexican workers were not ignorant labourers watching Spaniards perform magic. They were engineers in their own right, from a civilization that had built dikes miles long, aqueducts carrying water across the lake, and chinampa systems that turned shallow waters into fertile, gridded gardens. When Spanish carpenters and shipwrights explained how the hulls had to come together, they were speaking into an existing culture of large-scale construction. Measurements were translated. Technical terms found approximations in Nahuatl. Joints and angles were discussed across the lines of language. Mistakes were made, corrected, learned from. All of this had to be fed. Armies needed maize, beans, salt, cloth. Porters needed rest and provisions. Horses needed fodder. Iron had to be guarded on the road. Negotiations with local polities had to secure safe passage. What later looks like a simple line on a map, coast to highland, was in reality a braided river of logistics, with countless small decisions about who would carry what, who would be paid, who would resent being forced to help. By the time the brigantine pieces reached the Valley of Mexico, the operation had grown into a social fact. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of households had some stake in it, some story about hauling planks or feeding strangers. The ships were not just Spanish machines. They were the product of a vast, coerced but also negotiated indigenous effort. On the shore of Texcoco's lake, Allied towns gave up land for a makeshift shipyard. Men who had spent their lives working in canoes on canals watched as dry hulls grew on the ground, taller than anything that moved on their waters. Sails were patched and stitched from cloth. Ropes were twisted and knotted. Iron nails and fittings, precious metal in a world that had no native iron industry, bit into wood. When the brigantines were finally assembled and launched, they did not instantly turn Cortés into a master of the lake. They were few in number compared to the hundreds, possibly thousands of Mexica canoes. Their drafts were deeper. They could be awkward in the shallows. Their crews had to learn a new rhythm. rowing and sailing on a body of water ringed by hostile shores, shallows, and chinampas, rather than on open sea. But they had three things that reshaped the balance. They could mount cannon, they could carry crossbowmen and arquebusiers along the edges of the city, and crucially they were platforms that could not be easily swamped by a single canoe charge in the way a narrow causeway column could be broken. Meanwhile, on land, the causeways, the city's lifelines, were being transformed from roads into battle lines. Three major causeways connected the island to the shore, to Tlacopan in the west, Iztapalapa in the south, and Tepeyac in the north. Each was a long strip of earth and stone, punctuated by bridges where canals cut underneath. In peacetime they channeled people, goods, and tribute. In wartime they became sequences of choke points. For a siege to work, Cortés and his allies needed to control these arteries, or at least hold enough segments of them to constrict movement. That meant advancing along them bit by bit, demolishing bridges to prevent sudden counterattacks, then rebuilding makeshift crossings when the attackers themselves needed to move forward. Day after day, weeks on end, the pattern repeated. Mixed columns of Spanish infantry and indigenous warriors would push along a causeway under a hail of stones, darts, and arrows from Mexica warriors in front of them and from canoes flanking them in the water. When they reached a gap gouged in the road, a missing bridge, they had to pause, exposed, while carpenters and soldiers dragged up beams filled in rubble, lashed together planks. Every span built for the attackers was also, potentially, a span that could be used by defenders in the next counterattack. The brigantines tried to break this stalemate. They patrolled beside the causeways, firing into clusters of Mexica canoes, attempting to drive them off while Allied engineers worked. They cut into the fragile wooden stakes and defences that ringed some sections of the lake. They became mobile artillery platforms that could strike at the flanks of city neighbourhoods that had once been sheltered by water. At the same time, water management, so central to the prosperity of the Mexica, began to turn against them. For generations, Tenochtitlan's rulers had treated the surrounding lake as something that could be shaped and tamed. Dikes separated brackish from fresh water. Aqueducts brought clean springs into the city. Canals were dredged. Chinampas were carefully maintained to keep nutrient-rich mud in place. This control of water allowed a dense urban population to flourish, with markets overflowing with produce and fish, and with drinking water that did not poison its own people. Under siege, every part of that system became vulnerable. Allied forces on the shore could attack the aqueducts that fed fresh water to the island. Brigantines and canoes could sabotage sections of dike or canal. Crossing points and sluices became contested tactical objectives. Clean water, once so abundant that it filled stone troughs and bathed the bodies of nobles in their palaces, began to be rationed. Inside the city, people still had access to the lake itself, but much of Lake Texcoco's water was brackish, not suitable for drinking in large quantities without consequences. Wells and stored water helped, but as fighting went on and infrastructure broke, the balance shifted. Illness from contaminated water, diarrhea, intestinal infections would have joined the diseases already circulating. In a cramped, stressed population, any breakdown of sanitation spreads quickly. Food moved along similar lines. Mexica canoes had once glided across the lake loaded with maize, beans, squash, pumpkins, chili peppers, and flowers. Tribute from around the Valley of Mexico and beyond had flowed steadily, day after day, into Tenochtitlan's markets. Now, each canoe that tried to bring in food risked interception. Allied towns on the shores refused, or were unable, to send their usual quotas. Chinampas closer to the besieged city were exposed to raids. Farmers, already thinned by disease, struggled to maintain production under constant threat of attack. Hunger rarely descends all at once. It creeps. First the variety of food narrows. Meat becomes rare, then almost absent. Luxury goods vanish. People eat more maize porridge and fewer vegetables. Then even the staples thin. Households begin to stretch rations, skipping meals so elders or children can eat. The body can endure this for a time, but the costs accumulate. Fatigue, vulnerability to infection, slowed healing of wounds. In a society that had prided itself on abundance, where feasts and market days were not only about sustenance, but about status and cosmic order, this progressive narrowing would have had psychological as well as physical weight. Each empty stall in Tlatelolco's great market, each canal with fewer canoes, each day when the pot held a little less than before sent a quiet message. The circle is tightening. Outside, Cortés and his allies saw only fragments of this suffering. Inside, it was everywhere. Warriors slept less, fought more, and still had families to worry about. Mothers tried to soothe hungry children while explosions echoed from the edges of the island. Priests performed rituals on temples that now looked out over water, broken by enemy ships and shorelines dotted with hostile camps. Siege warfare preys on more than bodies. It eats at time, hope, and the sense that tomorrow might be better than today. The Mexica were not passive. They launched daring night attacks against the brigantines, tried to burn them, boarded them when they could. They rebuilt broken sections of causeway, opened new breaches when attackers thought they were secure. They adapted, as they always had, to a changing battlefield. But adaptation under siege is conducted within narrowing bounds. Every counterstroke burns resources, men, food, wood, will, that cannot be easily replaced, especially when disease has already thinned the city's ranks and disrupted the political mechanisms that might otherwise have managed prolonged crisis. From the outside, the siege could look like a slow grind, a series of skirmishes on causeways and canals, an exchange of missiles across shrinking gaps. From within, it must have felt like living inside a tightening net, each knot another lost bridge, another burned canoe, another day of shorter rations. By the time the decisive afternoon came, the moment when the invaders finally pushed deep into the heart of the island, and the empire seemed to collapse all at once, that collapse was resting on months of prior strangulation. The brigantines carving up the lake, the contested causeways, the sabotage of waterworks, the exhaustion and hunger and constant fear inside the city. These were the long, invisible steps that made a sudden ending possible. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. But sometimes, after enough slow damage has accumulated, a single afternoon is all it takes for the break to finally show. By the last weeks of the siege, the pattern of the fighting would have felt almost familiar. Columns pushing along causeways, brigantines sweeping canoes from the water, barricades built overnight and torn down by noon, smoke rising from quarters the attackers had fought over before, lost, and then fought over again. The city seemed to be shrinking, not only in territory but in time. Days blurred into one another, each one a little hungrier, a little more exhausted than the last. And then, one afternoon, the pattern broke. There had been other pushes into the island, other penetrations into streets once far from the shore. But this time the movement didn't stop at the next canal or barricade. Spanish accounts talk about a coordinated advance. 3 main columns moving in, each with its own mass of indigenous allies, each supported, where the water allowed, by brigantines skimming along the flanks. Whether the choreography was as clean as later narratives suggest is hard to know. War rarely follows neat arrows on a map. But something about that day was different enough that even people who had been living this siege for weeks recognized it. By now, the outer neighborhoods had been fought over so often that rubble had become part of the landscape. Houses collapsed by cannon or fire turned into ready-made breastworks. Canals choked with debris created new, awkward crossings and unexpected pits. The invaders used this wreckage as cover. So did the defenders. Street by street, causeway by causeway, the city had been stripped of the ordinary structures that make urban life navigable. Landmarks were gone. What remained were lines of sight, where you could stand and shoot without being immediately seen, where a group could gather before launching a sudden rush. On the decisive afternoon, the attackers pressed those lines of sight deeper into the urban grid. Along the causeways, Allied forces had learned to move differently. At the start of the siege, they had tended to bunch behind the armoured Spaniards, letting them draw fire and absorb the first shock. Over time, as they watched how Mexica defenders reacted to cannon and cavalry, they adapted. Tlaxcalan and other warriors fanned out into side streets and among the ruins of houses, flanking positions that had seemed safe behind the main line. Men who had grown up fighting in the customary battlefield formations of central Mexico were now fighting an improvised urban war, matched against others from the same cultural world who were doing the same. Inside Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, command was fraying. The Mexica had already lost emperors in rapid succession. First Moctezuma II, then Cuitlahuac. Cuauhtémoc, younger, more explicitly associated in the sources with resistance and defiance, had taken on not only the political role of Tlatoani, but the symbolic burden of refusing surrender. Under him, local commanders kept their neighbourhoods together as best they could. Runners and messengers moved along alleys and through house compounds, carrying information about breached barricades, sudden fires, weak points in the ring of attackers. But messages travel more slowly in a city whose streets are constantly being remade by battle. When the 3 attacking columns pushed inward that day, they were not cutting into a clean grid, but into a maze partially of their own making. As they advanced, they tried to do what siege manuals from Europe would have recommended: destroy what might shelter counterattacks, open up lines where horse and artillery could be used. But the closer they got to the heart of the island, the less effective those tools became. Streets narrowed, canals broke up any straight charge, horses balked at steps and sudden drops, cannons could fire down the length of a lane, but only if a crew survived long enough to drag them into position. What took over was close fighting. Chroniclers speak of hand-to-hand combat in streets slick with mud and worse than mud, of roofs turned into platforms from which stones and spears rained down, of warriors grappling in doorways that had been household thresholds only months before. Here, armour mattered, but so did numbers and knowledge of the terrain. The Spanish corps, perhaps a few hundred men at this stage, between those who had originally followed Cortés and those who had come with Narvaez and later been folded into the coalition, were outnumbered by their indigenous allies by a huge margin. Tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan, Texcocan, Huexotzinco and other warriors filled the ranks, climbed the broken walls and surged across makeshift bridges. If you could have hovered above the city, the Spanish presence in that vast allied tide would have looked like threads of metal glint among a flood of cotton armour and painted shields. Their cannons and horses had mattered enormously in earlier battles, especially psychologically. But here, at the end, in the narrow guts of a ruined city, it was the allies who turned the flood into a force. As the attackers closed in, Cuauhtémoc and his advisers seemed to have faced a narrowing set of options. Some accounts suggest he ordered the remaining population and warriors to concentrate in the Tlatelolco sector, the area of the great market that had been a beating commercial heart for the entire region. That concentration, if it happened as described, had a dual logic. It placed people near the still-functioning canoe routes on the northern side of the island, preserving some last capacity for movement across the lake. It also gathered defenders in dense numbers around a symbolic centre. Protect the market, protect the heart, protect the temples nearby, and perhaps protect the relationship with the gods that underwrote the entire Mexica cosmic order. But gathering so many people into a shrinking space also created its own vulnerabilities. A single successful push into that crowded quarter could have cascading effects. Once the attackers breached the edge of such a concentration, there were fewer places to fall back to that weren't already packed with the wounded, the hungry, the terrified. Descriptions of the final clash in Tlatelolco's market square are vivid, but also contradictory. Spanish and Tlaxcalan sources emphasize the chaos of victory, lines breaking, Mexica resistance crumbling, people throwing themselves into the water to escape. Indigenous accounts closer to Mexica perspectives preserve more of the anguish, the sound of weeping, the sense of a world ending. There's mention of nobles and priests trying to maintain some form of ritual in the midst of catastrophe, of banners planted and then toppled. What seems consistent across narratives is that widespread, organised resistance within the central zone became impossible. Local groups surely continued to fight stubbornly in side streets and houses. Individuals and small bands almost certainly slipped away in canoes whenever they could. But the capacity to direct the defence as a unified effort, to reposition forces in a meaningful way across the city, collapsed. Command did not stop in a single moment. Like a switch flipped, it frayed, then tore, and then came the capture. Cuauhtémoc's attempt to escape by canoe, if we follow the dominant tradition, fits the logic of the moment. With central resistance crumbling and the market area penetrated, staying meant almost certain death. and likely a death that could be framed by the attackers as a trophy. Leaving by water held out some possibility of continuing the struggle from allied or subordinate towns around the lake, or from more distant regions where Mexican influence still carried weight. The empire, after all, was not just an island city. It was a network of tribute relationships and military obligations stretching across highlands and coasts. But the lake that had once sheltered and empowered Tenochtitlan was no longer a safe avenue of retreat. Brigantines and allied canoes patrolled it. The web that had been drawn around the city's walls also extended over its waters. According to Spanish chroniclers, one of those brigantines intercepted the canoe carrying Cuauhtémoc. He was brought on board and presented to Cortés. The famous exchange, Cuauhtémoc asking to be killed rather than humiliated, Cortés refusing, is filtered through the sensibilities of men who wanted to write themselves as noble victors and their enemies as tragic, almost classical figures. But beneath the rhetoric lies a clear fact. The last Mexican emperor was now a prisoner. Symbolically, that moment was powerful enough that many later writers treated it as the instant the empire died. A single person, the Tlatoani, had come to embody not just political leadership but the very idea of Mexican sovereignty. Take him and you take everything. That is how conquest narratives like to work. One head cut off, one crown taken, one banner lowered, and history moves on. In reality, what ended that afternoon and what continued are harder to separate. What did end, in a very concrete way, was the autonomy of Tenochtitlan as an independent, functioning capital. With its main defensive positions broken, its leadership captured or killed, its people starving and surrounded, the city could no longer operate as the unquestioned centre of a tributary world. The rituals that had anchored imperial legitimacy, the great public ceremonies on the Templo Mayor, the orderly flow of tribute through the market, the formal reception of embassies, were shattered. In their place came fires, corpses, and the rough imposition of a new order. The infrastructural heart of Mexican power was also wrecked. Temples lay damaged or ruined. Palaces that had held archive-like stores of cloth and cacao and feathers were looted. Water systems had been dismantled or fouled. Chinampa networks nearest the city had been ravaged. Even if, in some alternate history, the invaders had suddenly vanished the next day, it would have taken years of coordinated effort to restore the island to its former capacity. That sort of restoration demands stable governance and broad cooperation, exactly the things the siege and fall had blown apart. Yet much did not end. The people themselves did not vanish in an afternoon. Large numbers of Mexica and other residents of the Valley of Mexico survived the siege, the hunger, the fighting. They were forced into new patterns of life, labouring under new lords, paying tribute to new masters, rebuilding the very city that had just been broken. Many of the hands that hauled stones to raise churches and colonial palaces were the same ones that had once hauled stones for pyramids and causeways. Languages did not disappear overnight. Neither did religious ideas, social ties, or memories of what had been. Beyond the lake, many towns and regions that had once been part of the Mexican imperial orbit continued to exist with their own internal structures. Some had changed sides earlier in the war, aligning with Cortés and his allies. Others had resisted longer or more ambiguously, and now faced the uneasy task of negotiating their place in a new hierarchy. In some of these places, resistance to Spanish control would flare again and again across the 16th century, not in the form of a single grand imperial army, but as local uprisings, quiet evasions, refusals to pay, and occasional armed revolts. So why did so many contemporaries, both European and indigenous, describe the empire's fall as sudden, as if a world had been cut in half in a single afternoon? Part of the answer lies in human perception. Long stresses, like a siege, are hard to narrate. They are lived in the body as a succession of similar days: thirst, hunger, fatigue. Their changes are incremental: one less canoe on the canal, one more friend missing from the group that goes to fetch water, one more house burned on the far shore. The dramatic ending, in contrast, concentrates experience. Noise peaks, smoke thickens. The number of dead in a single plaza or street overwhelms the senses. For those present, that spike of intensity can rewrite their memory of everything that came before. Months of decline compress into the story of a single day when the defenders finally broke. Another part is psychological. People need stories that give shape to catastrophe. Saying, "We were slowly strangled by disease and hunger and a long grinding siege" is not only less dramatic, it also offers little in the way of moral or cosmic explanation. Saying, "On this day, at this hour, our emperor was taken and our city fell," creates a focal point. It can be ritualized, mourned, or celebrated. It turns a messy, drawn-out process into an event. Spectacle mattered too. The visual impact of that final penetration into Tlatelolco, the smoke, the crowds, the banners falling, the figure of Cuauhtémoc brought before Cortés, would have stuck in the mind. Spanish writers leaned into this, crafting a climax that matched European expectations of how conquest should look. Indigenous annalists, writing later under colonial oversight but drawing on older oral memories, also fixed attention on the market square and the capture of the ruler. Even if their feelings about the moment were utterly different, the narrative gravity of that scene pulled them in the same direction. And then there is exhaustion. By the time that afternoon arrived, almost everyone involved had been living in a state of extreme stress for many months. When a long strain finally breaks, the relief, dark relief, even for the defeated because uncertainty has at least given way to a known horror, can make it feel instantaneous. People later say, "And then it was over," not because the underlying processes stopped, but because their capacity to continue tracking those processes collapsed with them. In all of this, it is easy to let the small Spanish corps loom larger than it was. Their armour, steel, horses and guns made them conspicuous, and their literacy ensured their voices would shape later histories. But on that afternoon, as the last great push into the heart of the Lake City unfolded, they were surrounded, supported and in many ways enabled by a far greater number of indigenous allies. Tlaxcalan captains and warriors, along with men from many other central Mexican polities, had their own reasons for fighting: revenge for earlier conquests, hopes of loosening Mexica tribute demands, calculations about how best to survive in a reordered world. Without them, the siege would likely have been impossible. Without them, the final breaches into Tlatelolco's core might never have been made. So when we say that 168 men destroyed the largest empire in the Americas in a single afternoon, we are repeating a story crafted by those 168 and their patrons, a story that condenses a continent of labour and conflict into a digestible myth. The reality is that a small Spanish centre sat inside a much larger ring of indigenous force, and that the single afternoon rested on layers of earlier disease, political fracture, and logistical strain. Still, from the perspective of someone standing in Tlatelolco's market as the last defences failed, the feeling of suddenness would have been real. 1 hour you're behind a barricade, eyes fixed on a narrow lane. The next, the barricade is gone, the enemy is all around, the emperor has vanished, and smoke blots out the sky. Whatever comes after, you know that the world you woke up in will not return. What did come after was not emptiness, but a long, uneven process of rebuilding under new masters. Stone by stone, house by house, the ruined island would be reshaped into another capital, one that claimed continuity even as it rested on conquest. The empire in one sense had seemed to fall in an afternoon. In another sense it survived as memories, as people, as patterns of labour and landscape that refused to vanish. To understand how those continuities and fractures played out, we have to follow the story beyond the smoke of that single day into the quieter but no less transformative years that followed. In the immediate aftermath, the change would have been felt in the most basic ways first. Hunger did not stop just because the banners changed. If anything, it sharpened. The siege had already ravaged food stores, Canals were clogged with wreckage and bodies. Chinampas closest to the city had been trampled, cut, or abandoned. Now, instead of organising what little remained through a familiar tribute system, survivors found themselves answering to new commanders, some Spanish, many indigenous, all trying to assert control over a devastated landscape. Reports from the first months and years speak of famine and disease continuing to take lives long after the last formal fighting ended. People who had endured the siege then had to survive its consequences: polluted water, disrupted agriculture, the movement and gathering of populations into new, more tightly controlled spaces. The logic of empire did not vanish, it just changed hands. Where Mexico officials had once monitored tribute and labour, Spanish and allied indigenous authorities began to do something similar, now in the name of the king across the sea and of God. Cortés and his circle quickly moved to reimagine the political order. They did not have the manpower to rule millions directly, so they leaned on what already existed. Many pre-existing towns retained their local leaders, now recognized as caciques in Spanish documents. These figures translated demands downward: new tribute lists, new labour drafts, new expectations about church attendance and instruction. In former Mexica heartlands, noble lineages that could prove their status often found ways to remain in positions of authority, at least on paper. Some descendants of Tenochtitlan's elite would serve for generations as intermediaries, signing documents in Nahuatl and Spanish, arguing over land boundaries in colonial courts. The reorganization of rule was not a clean replacement of one ruling class with another. It was a layering. Spanish officials on top, indigenous nobles beneath, commoners at the base, much as before, but with tribute now flowing toward different temples and palaces. Alliances too had to be sorted out. During the campaign, Cortés had promised much to his indigenous partners: land, loot, a relaxation of Mexica tribute burdens, maybe even a privileged standing in the new order. Tlaxcala, in particular, had wagered everything on this bet. So what happened when the dust settled? In the short term, some promises were honoured. Tlaxcala received formal recognition as a loyal republic under the Spanish crown. Its nobles won exemptions from certain taxes and gained the right to carry Spanish-style coats of arms. Tlaxcalan warriors and colonists would later participate in new campaigns, pushing Spanish and allied power into northern Mexico and beyond, carrying with them memories of what their help had purchased. Other allies found their rewards more fragile. Some towns that had joined Cortés late or under duress struggled to have their contributions acknowledged. In some regions, Spanish encomenderos, men granted rights to indigenous labour and tribute, treated allied communities only slightly better than former enemies. Promises thinned out when they ran up against the appetites of conquistadors, the needs of colonial administration and simple forgetfulness. Over time, alliances that had seemed clear during the siege blurred and were renegotiated. Tlaxcala defended its privileges repeatedly in writing, sending messengers and legal petitions to Mexico City and to Spain. Other towns did the same, invoking their aid to Cortés whenever new burdens were imposed. Sometimes these arguments worked, sometimes they did not. The early post-conquest decades in central Mexico are full of quiet paper battles, as much as armed ones. Communities presenting maps, genealogies, and testimonies to claim the status they believed they had earned in 1521. Meanwhile, the ruined island itself was being remade. Cortés chose not to abandon Tenochtitlan's site. Instead, he and his engineers decided to build a new capital directly on the old one. Lakeside geography that had once made the Mexica capital powerful would now serve Spanish ambitions. Streets were straightened according to European ideas of urban order, but many followed old causeways and paths. Churches rose on or near the platforms of temples. Stones from the Templo Mayor and other sacred buildings were pried out and reused in the walls of cathedrals, palaces, and administrative offices. The new name, Mexico City, signalled both rupture and continuity, an echo of Mexica, but aimed at a wider imperial horizon. The labour that made this possible came largely from indigenous hands. Systems of forced and semi-forced labour, encomienda, repartimiento, channeled workers from the surrounding towns into building projects, road maintenance, and service in Spanish households. Chinampas were repaired. but their produce increasingly fed urban markets organized under colonial rules, where the Aztec Empire had extracted cacao, cotton, feathers, and corn as tribute. The colonial system would add new demands: silver from mines, wheat from newly planted fields, labor for distant haciendas. The landscape changed slowly but profoundly. Over decades and centuries, the lake itself would be drained, altered, and canalized to suit new priorities. But in the years immediately after the fall, it still lay there, a familiar body of water reflecting unfamiliar towers and crosses. How that moment of transformation has been remembered is a history of its own. For early Spanish chroniclers, the story became a triumph, a small band of Christians aided by Providence, toppling a mighty but supposedly tyrannical pagan empire. The emphasis fell on the courage and ingenuity of a few, on steel and horses, on banners of the Virgin raised over shattered idols. The role of indigenous allies was acknowledged, but often framed as supporting actors in a drama whose heroes spoke Spanish. Indigenous analysts and painters working in Nahuatl and other languages preserved different emphases. Their accounts are filled with laments, with metaphors of broken flowers and scattered feathers, with the sense of a world darkening. Yet they also show adaptation, lists of new rulers, careful records of land holdings under colonial rule, genealogies that thread right through the supposed end of history and keep going. In their view, the fall of Tenochtitlan was not the end of their peoples, but one devastating turn in a much longer story. Modern scholarship and public memory add still more layers. In Mexico today, Cuauhtémoc can be honoured as a symbol of resistance, even as the colonial city that overwrote his capital is celebrated as a national centre. The figure of Malintzin can be debated as traitor, survivor, interpreter, or all of these at once. Tlaxcala's decision to ally can be seen as collaboration, strategic pragmatism, or both. The same events can be mourned as catastrophe and analysed as the birth of something new. And the question this whole episode raises never quite goes away. How could a small band of outsiders catalyse such a vast collapse? Part of the answer, as we've seen, lies in timing. The arrival of smallpox, the stresses already fissuring the tribute system, the political discontents among subject cities, the ways in which long-standing rivalries could be harnessed. Part lies in technology and tactics. Steel blades, horses, firearms, the shock they produced in early encounters, the way they fed Cortés's aura of invincibility at key moments. But part lies in stories. The Spaniards framed themselves as the spearhead of a world historical change, and many people on all sides came over time to inhabit versions of that narrative. To say that 168 men destroyed an empire in a single afternoon is to mistake the spark for the whole fire, yet sparks do matter. A small, well-placed ignition source, in a structure already dry and strained, can bring the roof down faster than anyone imagined. As you lie here listening, you might think about other moments like this, in other times and places. Points where a few decisions, a few people, seem to tip enormous systems into new configurations. Were those changes inevitable, waiting only for a trigger? Or were they contingent, fragile, dependent on accidents of weather, illness, misunderstanding? You might wonder what it felt like to walk through early Mexico City, past walls built from temple stones, hearing prayers in Latin and Nahuatl layered over each other. To be an elder remembering the rituals of the Templo Mayor while watching grandchildren learn new catechisms. To be a Tlaxcalan veteran, weighing the rewards and disappointments of the alliance you had helped make real. History does not give definite answers to those internal questions. It offers traces, fragments, probabilities. The rest we fill in with careful imagination. If you'd like to keep exploring how deep these patterns run, far beyond empires and into the deep past of our species, there's a book about prehistoric secrets that dives into those long arcs, bottlenecks, expansions, and the strange ways a few can shape the many. You can read more about it and find a link to buy it at sleepytimehistory.com. Before you drift fully into sleep, if this journey through Tenochtitlan's last days has kept you company, you can gently tap like or subscribe so that more quiet histories can find their way to you. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment too, maybe with where you're listening from tonight. Those little signals help this kind of slow, reflective storytelling reach others who might need it. For now, you can let the questions linger without rushing to answer them. A lake city turned inland capital, an empire that seemed to fall in an afternoon, yet lived on in people and patterns for centuries. A handful of newcomers, and a continent already full of its own histories. You can let those images recede, like distant lights across dark water, and follow your own thoughts wherever they are drifting.